The iron collar around Elena Ashford's throat had worn a permanent groove into her skin after 17 years of captivity. She no longer remembered what it felt like to breathe without its weight pressing against her windpipe, just as she no longer remembered the sound of her own name spoken with love instead of ownership. The wagon lurched over another pothole in the cobblestones leading to Ravencrest Central Market, and Elena's chains rattled against the wooden slats. Around her, 24 other slaves huddled in various stages of resignation and terror. She'd learned long ago not to offer comfort to the newcomers. It only made the inevitable separation harder to bear. "Fresh stock today," Marcus the trader's voice boomed across the market square as their wagon creaked to a stop. "Prime breeding material and skilled laborers from the Eastern Territories." Elena kept her eyes fixed on her hands, noting absently how the scars from her last master's lessons had finally faded to thin white lines. Lord Blackwood had been particularly creative with his punishments, though she'd endured worse in the years before him. The succession of owners blurred together now, a parade of faces united only by their capacity for cruelty and their eventual boredom with her. She was what the traders called a problem slave. Bad luck seemed to follow her from master to master. Accidents happened around her. Tools broke at crucial moments. Horses went lame, crops failed, business deals soured. One by one, her owners had decided she brought more trouble than she was worth, selling her off to recoup their losses before her curse could ruin them completely. Elena had stopped believing in coincidence years ago. Something inside her was broken in ways that went deeper than flesh and bone, something that poisoned everything she touched. She'd made peace with it, this darkness that clung to her like a second skin. Better to accept what she was than to keep hoping for what she could never be. "You there?" Marcus's scarred hand closed around Elena's upper arm, hauling her to her feet with practiced efficiency. "You'll fetch a good price today, even with your history." Elena didn't respond. Speaking without permission had been beaten out of her by her third master, a merchant who'd taken particular offense to her insolent tongue. She'd learned to communicate with her eyes instead, a skill that had served her well in the years since. The slave platform rose before them like an altar of human misery. Elena had stood on dozens of similar stages over the years, had felt the weight of calculating stares, measuring her worth in gold and flesh. The routine never changed: the inspection of her teeth, the assessment of her muscle tone, the casual discussion of her potential for bearing children as if she were livestock being evaluated for breeding. But as Marcus shoved her toward the wooden steps, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a prickle of awareness that had nothing to do with fear. The air itself seemed to thicken around her, charged with an energy that made every nerve in her body sing with sudden, inexplicable tension. Someone was watching her. Not the usual appraisal of potential buyers, but something deeper and more focused. Elena fought the urge to lift her head and search the crowd. Drawing attention to herself never ended well. "Ladies and gentlemen of Ravencrest," Marcus's voice rang out across the square. "Behold a rare prize, a woman of noble bearing despite her circumstances. Look at those bones, that carriage. This one has breeding written in her very bloodline." Elena's jaw clenched. The irony of Marcus's words would have been amusing if they weren't so painful. She did have noble blood, or had once upon a time. But that girl, that pampered princess who'd laughed in sunlit gardens and believed the world was good, had died 17 years ago in a burning castle. What stood on this platform now was just the shell she had left behind. The bidding started slow, as it always did. Minor lords looking for kitchen servants offered paltry sums that made Marcus scowl with theatrical disappointment. Elena let her mind drift, a survival mechanism she'd perfected over the years. Better to be absent during the worst of the humiliation. That's when she felt it again, that presence pressing against her consciousness like a physical touch. This time she couldn't stop herself from looking up. The crowd seemed to part around him like water around a ship's prow. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, each step deliberate and economical. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black leather that looked both expensive and practical. His face was sharp angles and controlled strength, the kind of masculine beauty that belonged on ancient statues rather than living flesh. But it was his eyes that stopped Elena's breath in her throat. Golden eyes that burned with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Eyes that widened slightly as they locked onto hers, as if he was seeing something he'd been searching for his entire life. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The noise of the market faded to a distant hum as something deep inside her chest cracked open like an egg. Warmth flooded through her veins for the first time in years, not the feverish heat of pain or infection, but something clean and vital and impossibly right. This stranger with golden eyes felt like coming home. The realization terrified her more than any master's cruelty ever had. Elena had learned the hard way that wanting things, caring about people, hoping for better, all of it led to disappointment and pain. She'd spent years carefully destroying every soft emotion inside her, turning her heart into something small and hard and protected. But looking into those eyes, she felt every wall she'd built threatening to crumble. "Your Majesty!" Marcus's voice cracked with sudden panic. "King Darius! What an unexpected honor!" The name hit Elena like a physical blow. King Darius Blackthorn, the Alpha King of Ravencrest, ruler of the most powerful werewolf territory in the known world. She'd heard whispers of him even in the furthest reaches of the kingdom. Stories of his ruthless efficiency, his complete lack of mercy for those who crossed him, his refusal to take a mate despite the political advantages it would bring. They said he was more beast than man when angered, that his wolf was the size of a small horse, that he'd killed his own father in single combat to claim the throne. Elena had dismissed most of the stories as the kind of legends that always grew around powerful men. But standing this close to him, feeling the raw authority that seemed to radiate from his very bones, she could believe every terrifying tale. Darius stepped onto the platform with fluid grace, ignoring Marcus entirely. His golden gaze never left Elena's face, and she found herself unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at her to show proper deference. "How much?" His voice was deep and rough, sending shivers down Elena's spine that had nothing to do with fear. Marcus blinked in confusion. "Your Majesty?" "How much for her?" Darius repeated, his tone carrying the kind of authority that made grown men prostrate themselves. Elena watched Marcus's expression cycle through surprise, calculation, and barely restrained greed. "For you, Your Majesty? 1,000 gold pieces. She's prime breeding stock. Perfect for..." "Done." Darius reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coins. He tossed it to Marcus without bothering to count the contents. "Release her. Now." 1,000 gold pieces. Elena's mind reeled. That was more than most slaves sold for in their entire lifetimes. It was enough to buy a small estate, a fleet of merchant ships, an army of common soldiers. Why would the Alpha King of Ravencrest pay such an enormous sum for her? Marcus fumbled with the keys to Elena's shackles, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. The moment the iron bonds fell away from her wrists and ankles, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten, the absence of constant grinding pain. But before she could process the sensation fully, Darius stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his scent, something wild and woodsy with an underlying darkness that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. Elena went perfectly still. Wolf? She'd been told she was wolfless since childhood, a genetic anomaly that had made her worthless in the eyes of her pack and easy prey for the raiders who'd taken her. But something about this man's presence was awakening things inside her that had been dormant for so long she'd thought they were dead. "Come," Darius said simply, holding out his hand to her. Elena stared at his offered palm, strong, scarred, with long fingers that could probably span her throat without effort. She should be terrified. Every survival instinct should be screaming at her to run, to hide, to get away from this dangerous predator who radiated power like heat from a forge. Instead, she placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded. Power slammed into Elena like a physical force, driving her to her knees on the wooden platform. Images flashed through her mind too quickly to process. A golden-eyed boy laughing in a sunlit garden. Small hands covered in dirt from digging in flower beds. a voice calling her name with desperate love and terror, flames consuming everything she'd ever known. Elena, Darius whispered, and the name hit her like lightning splitting a tree. Elena. Not the number she'd been called for 17 years, not girl or slave, or any of the degrading labels that had replaced her identity. Her actual name, spoken with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes for the first time in over a decade. "How do you know that name?" she whispered, her voice rusty from years of careful silence. But even as she asked the question, memories were surfacing like bubbles rising through dark water. A castle with white stone towers, a boy with golden eyes who'd been her constant companion, her protector, her dearest friend. The day he'd promised he would always find her, always protect her, no matter what happened. The day raiders had torn her from the only home she'd ever known and left that promise in ashes. Danny, the childhood nickname, slipped out before she could stop it. Darius's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing pain so raw it made Elena's chest tight. His golden eyes filled with tear he refused to let fall. "Hello, little star," he said softly, using the pet name he'd given her because she'd loved to watch the night schema. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Elena's legs gave out entirely. She would have fallen if Darius hadn't caught her, his strong arms pulling her against his chest as 17 years of buried memories came crashing back in a tidal wave of recognition and loss. Prince Daniel had been her childhood protector, her first friend, the boy she'd followed everywhere with the devoted adoration only a 7-year-old could manage. He'd taught her to read, to climb trees, to howl at the moon like the wolves they both carried in their blood. He'd been 12 to her 7 when she'd been taken, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to prevent it. And now he was here, transformed by time and necessity into something harder and more dangerous, but still unmistakably hers. "They told me everyone was dead," Elena whispered against his chest, breathing in his scent and finally understanding why it felt like coming home. "The raiders said they'd killed the royal family." They nearly did. Darius's arms tightened around her as if he could somehow make up for 17 years of separation through the strength of his embrace. "I fought them when they took you. A blade missed my heart by inches. When I woke up 3 days later, you were gone. Everyone said you were dead, but I never believed it." "The mate bond," Elena whispered, finally understanding the strange pull she'd felt toward him from the moment their eyes met. "We were already bonded, even as children." Destined mates often recognized each other young, though the full bond didn't manifest until they were old enough to complete it. Elena had always wondered why she'd never felt complete with any of her masters, why there had always been a hollow ache in her chest that she couldn't name or heal. She'd been missing half of her soul without even realizing it. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended, but 17 years of suffering couldn't be dismissed easily. Pain flashed across Darius's features. "I tried. Gods, Elena, I tried everything. I sent search parties to every corner of the known world. I questioned every slave trader, followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. But you'd been changed." He touched her dark hair gently, and Elena remembered that it had once been lighter, more honey brown than black. Years of harsh treatment and malnutrition had altered her in ways that went beyond physical appearance. "They broke you systematically," Darius continued, his voice rough with suppressed rage. "Took away your name, your memories, your sense of self, made you into something I wouldn't recognize, even with the mate bond to guide me." Elena closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the pampered princess she'd once been with the broken slave she'd become. The transformation had been so gradual, so complete, that she'd forgotten there had ever been another version of herself. "I'm not the same person you lost," she said quietly. "Neither am I." Darius pulled back slightly, studying her face with intense golden eyes. "The question is whether who we've become can find a way back to each other." Before Elena could respond, Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, is there anything else you require?" Darius's expression went cold in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When he turned to face the slave trader, Elena could practically feel the temperature drop around them. If I hear so much as a whisper about this transaction, Darius said in a voice like winter wind, I will personally ensure you never speak again. Are we understood? Marcus went pale as parchment and dropped to his knees. Yes, your majesty. Completely understood. Darius turned back to Elena, his expression softening. Can you ride? Elena shook her head. Slaves didn't ride horses. She'd walked everywhere she'd ever gone in her captivity. Without another word, Darius swept her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Elena tensed instinctively. Sudden movements and unwanted touching had been followed by pain for so many years that the response was automatic. But Darius's touch was gentle, careful, his arms providing shelter rather than threat. For the first time in 17 years, Elena felt safe in another person's embrace. A massive black stallion waited at the edge of the market square, its eyes as intelligent as its master's. The horse was enormous, easily 17 hands high, with a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian in the afternoon light. Darius settled Elena on the horse's back with infinite care, then swung up behind her. His solid warmth surrounded her like armor, and Elena found herself relaxing against his chest despite years of conditioning that screamed at her to remain alert. Hold on, he murmured against her ear, his breath sending unexpected shivers down her spine. They rode out of Ravencrest at a pace that ate up ground without jarring Elena's already aching body. The Alpha King's castle loomed in the distance, Shadowmere built of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It should have looked forbidding, like a monument to power and isolation. Instead, as they approached the massive gates, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in 17 years. She felt like she was going home. The feeling should have been impossible. She'd been a slave for longer than she'd been free, had learned to expect nothing but pain and disappointment from life. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that had been systematically beaten out of her. But wrapped in Darius's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat against her back, Elena felt something deep inside her beginning to unfurl like a flower that had been waiting its entire life for the right sunlight. What happens now? She asked softly as they passed through the castle gates. Now you remember who you are, Darius replied. Now you heal. Now you decide if the bond we shared as children is strong enough to survive what we've both become. Elena closed her eyes, letting herself absorb the weight of possibility in his words. After 17 years of being told she was worthless, broken, good for nothing but servitude and suffering, the idea that she might be something more felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As Shadowmere's gates closed behind them, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving one life behind and stepping into another. The question was whether she had the courage to let herself believe it was real. Shadowmere Castle was nothing like Elena remembered. The fortress that loomed before them had been transformed from the warm, welcoming home of her childhood into something darker and more forbidding. Black stone walls stretched impossibly high, their surfaces polished to an obsidian sheen that reflected nothing. Gothic towers twisted upward at sharp angles, their windows glowing with a cold blue light that made Elena's skin crawl. This was not the golden castle where she'd once chased butterflies through sunlit corridors. This was the seat of a king who ruled through fear rather than love. I know it's changed, Darius said quietly, as if he'd sensed her thoughts. After the attack, after you were taken, I rebuilt it to be a fortress first and a home second. Elena nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. She'd done something similar with her own heart, built walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them. The difference was that Darius had the power to transform stone and mortar along with his emotions. Guards in black armor lined the courtyard, their faces hidden behind wolf-shaped helmets that gleamed menacingly in the torchlight. They stood at attention as Darius rode past, but Elena could feel their curiosity burning through their discipline. Word would spread quickly through the castle that their king had returned with a woman, and not just any woman, but a slave purchased from the market. Your Majesty, a familiar voice called out as they approached the main steps. Elena looked up to see a tall, lean man striding toward them, his silver-streaked brown hair and sharp green eyes exactly as she remembered them. Marcus, she breathed, using the name she'd called him as a child. Marcus Aldrich had been more than just Darius's advisor. He'd been a second father to both of them after their parents died. He'd taught Elena her letters, bandaged her scraped knees, and told her stories when nightmares kept her awake. Looking at him now, she could see the years had been both kind and cruel. His face was lined with experience and worry, but his eyes still held the warmth she remembered. Those eyes widened as he got his first clear look at her face into the torchlight. Elena watched him struggle with recognition, seeing the moment when memory aligned with reality. "Sweet mother of wolves," Marcus whispered, his composure cracking. "Elena, is it really you?" Elena tried to speak, but her throat had closed around the words. 17 years of careful emotional control warred with the desire to throw herself into the arms of the man who'd been her protector and friend. Darius dismounted with fluid grace, then reached up to help Elena down. Her legs shook as her feet touched the ground, whether from exhaustion, malnutrition, or the overwhelming rush of recognition. She couldn't say. "It's her, Marcus," Darius confirmed, his hand settling on Elena's back with gentle possessiveness. "I found her." Marcus approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at sudden movements. When he was close enough, he reached out with trembling fingers to touch her face. "Your eyes," he said wonderingly. "I'd know those eyes anywhere. Though they're—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with how to finish the sentence. "Older," Elena said quietly. "Harder. I know." The violet eyes that had once sparkled with innocent joy now held depths that spoke of experiences no child should ever endure. Elena could see her own transformation reflected in Marcus's expression, the recognition of familiar features altered by years of suffering. "We have much to discuss," Darius said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of a king addressing his council. "But first, Elena needs food, rest, and medical attention." "Of course," Marcus straightened, slipping back into his role as chief advisor. "I've already prepared the tower room, the one that's been waiting," Darius finished. "Yes, that will do perfectly." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What tower room?" The look that passed between Darius and Marcus was heavy with unspoken meaning. "Your room," Darius said simply. "I had it moved to the eastern tower after the reconstruction. It's been maintained exactly as you left it." Elena's breath caught. "For 17 years? I couldn't bear to change it," Darius admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice made Elena's chest tight. "It was the only way I could feel close to you." They climbed the winding stone staircase in relative silence, Elena's bare feet making no sound on the cold steps. The tower was tall, higher than anything in the original castle, and by the time they reached the heavy oak door at the top, Elena's legs were trembling with exhaustion. Darius opened the door with an ornate iron key, and Elena stepped into her past. The room was exactly as she remembered it, but somehow more vivid than her childhood memories had preserved. Moonlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating a space that had been designed for a princess rather than the broken slave she'd become. A massive four-poster bed dominated one wall, its deep purple curtains embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like captured stars. A fireplace crackled warmly in the corner, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and polished wooden furniture. But it was the walls that made Elena sink to her knees in overwhelming recognition. They were covered with paintings, dozens of them, all depicting the same subject. A young girl with dark honey-brown hair and violet eyes, captured in moments of pure childhood joy. Elena reading beneath an oak tree, her small face serious with concentration. Elena chasing butterflies in the castle gardens, her laughter almost audible in the brush strokes. Elena asleep in a field of wildflowers, her dark hair spread around her like a halo. "You painted all of these," Elena whispered, recognizing Darius's artistic style and the confident brushwork and attention to detail. "I had to," Darius said quietly. "After you were taken, I was terrified I'd forget your face, forget the way you looked when you were happy. So I painted every memory I could hold on to." Elena rose on unsteady legs, moving closer to examine the paintings. Each one was a love letter rendered in oils and pigment, proof that she'd been cherished in ways she'd forgotten were possible. In one painting, She was maybe 4 years old, her gap-toothed grin bright with mischief as she held a frog she'd caught in the castle pond. In another, she was 6, fast asleep in the library with a book twice her size open across her lap. This one, Elena said, stopping before a painting near the window. In it, she was 7 years old, standing next to a 12-year-old Darius in the castle gardens. Both of them were covered in mud from head to toe, grinning at the artist despite their disheveled state. I remember this day. The great frog hunt, Darius said, moving to stand beside her. You were convinced you could train them to be palace guards. And you spent the entire afternoon helping me catch them, even though you knew it was impossible. Elena touched the painted surface gently, remembering the weight of unconditional friendship and acceptance. Marcus was furious about the mud. Marcus was furious about a lot of things, the older man said from the doorway, though his voice held fond exasperation rather than genuine anger, including 2 certain children who seemed determined to give me gray hair before my time. Elena turned to look at him, seeing the love and grief warring in his expression. You took care of us. I tried to, though I obviously failed when it mattered most. Marcus's voice was heavy with guilt that 17 years hadn't diminished. You didn't fail, Elena said firmly. You kept him alive. You helped him become strong enough to find me. That's not failure, that's success measured in different terms. Marcus blinked rapidly, clearly struggling with emotions he'd kept carefully controlled for nearly 2 decades. You've grown wise, little princess. I've grown hard, Elena corrected. There's a difference. Wisdom and hardness aren't mutually exclusive, Darius observed. Sometimes one requires the other. Elena moved to the window, looking out over the castle grounds that were slowly coming back to her memory. In the moonlight, she could make out the oak tree where she used to read, the flower beds where she'd helped the gardeners plant seeds each spring, the practice yards where Darius had been learning sword work when she'd been taken. Why did you keep all of this? She asked without turning around. Why torture yourself with reminders of what you'd lost? Because losing you was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, Darius said simply. But forgetting you would have been worse. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 17 years of devotion settling around her like a cloak. She'd spent so long believing she was worthless, disposable, easily forgotten. The evidence surrounding her suggested otherwise, but accepting that truth would require dismantling beliefs that had become the foundation of her survival. I don't know how to be her anymore, Elena said quietly. The girl in those paintings, the princess you've been waiting for, she's gone. What's left is something else entirely. Then I'll learn to love what's left, Darius replied without hesitation. Elena turned to face him, studying his expression in the firelight. What if what's left isn't worth loving? Impossible. The simple certainty in his voice made Elena's throat tight with emotion. You don't know what I've done to survive the compromises I made, the ways I debased myself, the things I allowed. I don't care. Darius crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. Whatever you did to stay alive. Whatever you endured to make it back to me. Nothing else matters. Elena stared up at him, seeing absolute conviction in his golden eyes. This wasn't the blind devotion of a boy clinging to childhood memories. This was a man who had looked at the full scope of human suffering and declared it irrelevant to worth. The slave markets, the masters who owned me, the things that were done. Elena's voice broke on the words she'd never spoken aloud. Some of it will never heal. Some scars go too deep. Then we'll work around them, Darius said practically. We'll build something new that accommodates what you've survived instead of pretending it never happened. Elena felt tears threatening for the 2nd time that day, a dangerous sign considering she'd thought herself cried out years ago. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of me? Of this? Of hoping for something that might be too good to be real. The last 17 years taught me that caring about things just gives people more ways to hurt you. Darius's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I can't promise you'll never be hurt again, he said quietly. But I can promise it will never be by my hand, and that I'll spend the rest of my life ensuring no one else gets the chance either. The vow hung between them, weighted with the kind of conviction that Elena had almost forgotten existed. She'd spent so long among people who made promises they had no intention of keeping that hearing words backed by genuine commitment felt like stepping into sunlight after years in darkness. "I need time," she said finally. "You have all the time you need," Darius assured her. "I've waited 17 years. I can wait longer if necessary." Elena nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "And you need time too. The boy I knew was kind and gentle. You've become something harder." "Harder, yes, but not cruel. Never cruel." Darius released her hands reluctantly. "I'll leave you to rest. There are guards outside your door, but they're for protection, not imprisonment. You're free to explore the castle, though I'd ask that you stay within the walls for now, until we know who might have followed us from the market." "Darius?" Elena called as he reached the door. He turned back, hope flickering in his golden eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for never giving up, for believing I was still alive when everyone else had given up hope, for bringing me home." Darius's smile was the first truly happy expression she'd seen from him since their reunion. "Thank you for surviving long enough for me to find you." After he left, Elena stood alone in the beautiful room, surrounded by painted memories of a childhood that felt like something from a fairy tale. Her reflection in the tall mirror showed her how much she'd changed. The dark hair that had once been light, the violet eyes that now held shadows they'd never been meant to carry, the sharp angles where softness used to be. She was 24 years old, but she felt ancient. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," Elena called, expecting to see Marcus or perhaps one of the castle servants. Instead, a young woman entered carrying a silver tray laden with food. She was perhaps 18 or 19, with auburn hair braided back from a heart-shaped face and kind brown eyes that held no judgment or pity. "Your Majesty," the girl said, dropping into a perfect curtsy. "I'm Sarah, one of the castle maids. His Majesty requested that I bring you something to eat." Elena stared at the title, feeling the disconnect between the honorific and her sense of self. "I'm not—" "Forgive me, but you are," Sarah interrupted gently. "King Darius may not have made a formal announcement yet, but everyone in the castle knows who you are. Princess Elena, the king's lost mate, returned home at last." Elena sank into a chair by the window, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations she didn't know how to meet. "I don't feel like a princess. If I may say so, Your Majesty, I don't think anyone feels like what they are when they're still becoming it." Sarah set the tray on the small table and began arranging the dishes with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother always said that titles are just words until we grow into the shape of them." Elena studied the young woman, surprised by the wisdom in her words. "You're very young to be so philosophical." Sarah smiled, and Elena caught a glimpse of steel beneath the soft exterior. "I come from the borderlands, Your Majesty. We grow up fast out there, or we don't grow up at all." The food Sarah had brought looked like a feast compared to the scraps Elena had subsisted on for years. Roasted chicken that smelled like herbs and butter, fresh bread that was still warm from the ovens, cheese that looked like it had been made that morning, and fruit so perfect it might have been painted for one of the still lifes in the castle's galleries. Elena's stomach cramped with hunger, but she forced herself to eat slowly. Too much too fast after years of near starvation would only make her sick. "Sarah?" Elena said as the maid moved to tidy the already pristine room. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "What do people say about me? In the castle, I mean. What are the rumors?" Sarah paused in her dusting, clearly weighing how honest to be. "They say you were taken as a child and held captive for 17 years. They say the king never stopped looking for you, never took another mate because he believed you were still alive." "And what do they think of that?" "Most think it's the greatest love story they've ever heard," Sarah said simply. "A few of the older nobles think he should have been more practical, should have married for political advantage instead of clinging to what they saw as a childhood fancy." Elena felt a familiar stab of inadequacy. "And now that I'm back, what do they think of the reality versus the legend?" Sarah turned to face her fully, her brown eyes serious. "They think you're the bravest person they have ever seen. To survive what you survived and still be able to love, that takes a kind of courage most people can't imagine." "Who says I'm still able to love?" "Anyone with eyes, Your Majesty. The way you look at the king, The way he looks at you, that's not something that can be faked or forced. Elena finished her meal in contemplative silence, processing Sarah's words along with the rich flavors that were awakening taste buds she'd thought were permanently numbed. When the maid had cleared away the dishes and left her alone, Elena found herself drawn back to the paintings on the walls. Each one told a story of a child who had been cherished, protected, celebrated for her very existence. The girl in those paintings had never known hunger, never felt the bite of shackles, never learned to flinch at sudden movements, or calculate the cost of speaking without permission. She had been loved completely and unconditionally, in the way children were meant to be loved. Elena pressed her fingers to the glass of the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens below. Somewhere in the castle, Darius was probably lying awake as well, wrestling with his own questions about whether the woman who'd returned could bridge the gap to the girl who'd been lost. The truth was that Elena didn't know if she was capable of the kind of love the princess in the paintings had inspired. 17 years of systematic brutalization had taught her to hoard her emotions, to never give anyone enough of herself that they could destroy her completely. But looking at the evidence of Darius's devotion surrounding her, feeling the warmth of a home she'd never expected to see again, Elena found herself wondering if maybe it was possible to heal from even the deepest wounds. The first step, she supposed, was admitting that she wanted to try. Elena fell asleep in the chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like lavender and home, dreaming for the first time in years of golden eyes and gentle hands that promised safety instead of pain. Elena woke to unfamiliar sensations. Soft fabric against her skin, sunlight warming her face without the harsh glare of iron bars, and silence that spoke of safety rather than the watchful tension that had defined her mornings for 17 years. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, afraid that movement would shatter the illusion and return her to whatever cell she'd been dreaming of escaping. But the purple silk curtains remained solid under her fingers. The painted faces on the walls continued to smile with captured joy, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the open windows on a breeze that carried no threat. She was still home, still free, still trying to understand what either of those words meant anymore. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Your Majesty?" Sarah's voice carried through the heavy door. "I've brought fresh clothes and breakfast, if you're ready." Elena sat up slowly, her body protesting movements it wasn't accustomed to making. 17 years of sleeping on stone floors and thin straw had left their mark in ways that would take more than one night of comfort to heal. "Come in," Elena called, her voice still rusty with disuse. Sarah entered with her arms full of fabric that caught the morning light like captured rainbows. Behind her came two other servants, carrying trays that made Elena's stomach clench with anticipation. "His Majesty thought you might like to try on some of your old dresses," Sarah said, laying the garments carefully across the massive bed. "They've been preserved all these years, though we took the liberty of having the seamstresses adjust them for your current size." Elena approached the bed with something approaching reverence. The dresses were exactly as she remembered them, rich velvets and silk brocades in jewel tones that had been chosen to complement her unusual coloring. But looking at them now, she felt like she was staring at costumes for a play she no longer knew how to perform. "I don't think I remember how to be a princess," Elena said quietly. "Perhaps," Sarah said diplomatically, "you could start by remembering how to be Elena." Elena picked up a dress of deep emerald velvet, holding it against herself as she looked in the ornate mirror. The color brought out the violet in her eyes and made her dark hair shine with hidden highlights. She looked almost like the girl in the paintings. If that girl had lived 17 hard years in the space of a single night. "Would you help me?" Elena asked. And the simple request felt like stepping off a cliff. Asking for help had been beaten out of her by her third master, a merchant who'd taken particular offense to what he'd called her grasping nature. She'd learned to do everything herself, to never show weakness or need, to become invisible in her self-sufficiency. But Sarah just smiled and moved to help her with the complicated lacings and hooks. The maid's touch was gentle but efficient, and Elena found herself relaxing under the careful ministrations. "Your Majesty," one of the other servants said hesitantly, "King Darius requests your presence in the library when you're shared. He says there are things you need to see." Elena's stomach tightened with apprehension. The library had been one of her favorite places as a child, but 17 years of experience had taught her that when men in power wanted to show her things, it rarely ended well for her. "Tell him I'll be there shortly," Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady. As the servants finished helping her dress and arranging her hair in a style that was simple but elegant, Elena caught herself checking her reflection obsessively. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, too thin, too sharp, with eyes that held knowledge no princess should ever possess. But she was clean and well-dressed and, for the moment, safe. It would have to be enough. Elena made her way through the castle corridors with the careful precision of someone who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. But as she walked, memories began to surface unbidden. Racing through these same halls as a child, her laughter echoing off the stone walls, Darius always just a step behind her with his longer legs and patient indulgence of her boundless energy. The library doors were massive things of carved oak that had intimidated her as a child. Now they simply looked like what they were, barriers between her past and present that she would have to choose to cross. Elena pushed them open and stepped into cathedral-like space that took her breath away. The library was enormous, with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling and reached so high they required rolling ladders to access the topmost volumes. Thousands upon thousands of books lined the walls in neat rows, their leather bindings creating a tapestry of knowledge and history. Tall windows let in streams of golden morning light that illuminated reading alcoves furnished with comfortable chairs and small tables. But it was the man standing in the center of the room who drew Elena's attention like a lodestone. Darius looked up from the ancient tome he'd been studying as she entered, and Elena felt the now familiar jolt of recognition mixed with stranger danger that seemed to define all her interactions with him. He was dressed simply today, dark trousers and a white shirt that was open at the throat, revealing the strong column of his neck and the faint scars that spoke of a life lived dangerously. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the compliment hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd forgotten that people could mean such words, could speak them without calculation or expectation of payment. The automatic deflection rose to her lips. Denial, self-deprecation, the careful diminishment of self that had become second nature. Instead, she said, "Thank you." The words felt foreign in her mouth, but they also felt true. She did look beautiful, or at least she looked like someone who remembered what beauty could be. "How did you sleep?" Darius asked, moving toward her with the careful movements of someone approaching a skittish animal. "Better than I have in years," Elena admitted, though I kept waking up expecting to find myself back in a cell somewhere. "That's normal. It'll take time for your body to trust that you're truly safe." Darius gestured toward the comfortable seating area near the windows. "Will you sit with me? There are things I want to show you, but only if you're ready." Elena settled into one of the leather chairs, noting how it seemed to embrace her rather than simply support her weight. Everything in this castle was designed for comfort rather than mere function, a luxury she'd forgotten existed. "What did you want to show me?" Darius returned to the table where he'd been working, picking up what looked like a journal bound in worn leather. "After you were taken, I started keeping records, not just of my search efforts, but of everything. My thoughts, my fears, the dreams I had about finding you." He handed her the journal, and Elena opened it to a random page. The handwriting was Darius's. She recognized the careful script from childhood notes he used to leave for her. But it was shakier, more desperate than she remembered. "Day 847 since Elena was taken," she read silently. "The dreams are getting worse. Last night I saw her calling for me, reaching out her hand, but every time I tried to grasp it, she faded away. Marcus says I should stop torturing myself, but he doesn't understand. The dreams are the only time I get to see her, even if they end in pain. I would rather have the agony of losing her every night than risk forgetting what her voice sounds like." Elena's throat closed around the words she wanted to speak. She turned the page, finding more entries that painted a picture of a man slowly being consumed by grief and desperate hope. Day 1203, another false lead today. A girl matching Elena's description was sold at the Millbrook Market 3 weeks ago, but when we finally tracked her down, it wasn't her. She had the right coloring, even the right age, but her eyes were brown instead of violet. I wanted to buy her anyway. to free her from whatever hell she was living. But Marcus convinced me it would only make the disappointment worse. How many girls like Elena are suffering while I search for one specific face in a sea of misery? Darius, Elena whispered, looking up at him with tears threatening. You wrote in this for 17 years? I had to. It was the only way to hold on to hope when everyone else had given up. He sat down across from her, his golden eyes never leaving her face. I wanted you to know that not a single day passed when I didn't think about you, didn't search for you, didn't believe I would find you again. Elena turned more pages, finding sketches scattered among the words, attempts to capture her face from memory, maps marking search routes, pressed flowers from places he'd looked for her. It was a monument to devotion that made her chest tight with emotions she didn't know how to process. Why are you showing me this? Because I need you to understand that what I feel for you isn't just nostalgia for what we had as children. It's not pity for what you've suffered or guilt over my failure to protect you. Darius leaned forward, his voice intense with conviction. I love the woman you are now, Elena. Not the memory of who you were, but the person sitting in front of me. Elena stared at him, seeing truth written in every line of his face. The journal in her hands was proof of a love that had endured 17 years of absence, that had grown stronger rather than weaker with time and distance. How can you love someone you don't know? She asked quietly. I do know you. Darius's voice was gentle but certain. I know you've survived things that would have broken most people. I know you are brave enough to trust again, despite every reason not to. I know you are strong enough to sit here talking to me instead of running away, even though every instinct is probably telling you that caring about anyone is dangerous. Elena felt exposed under his perceptive gaze, as if he could see through the careful walls she'd built around her heart. You don't know the worst of it, she said, falling back on her familiar defense. You don't know what I had to do, what I became. Then tell me. The simple request hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elena had never spoken of her years in captivity to anyone, partly because there had been no one safe enough to tell, and partly because giving voice to the memories felt like giving them power to hurt her again. I was sold 12 times in 17 years, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Each time to someone who found new ways to break me down, to make me smaller and more manageable. The first master tried to breed me like livestock. When that didn't work, he decided I was cursed and sold me to someone who thought pain might drive the demons out. Darius went very still, his hands clenching into fists on the arms of his chair. The third master was a collector of beautiful broken things. He liked to display me at parties, to show his guests what perfect submission looked like. Elena's voice remained flat, clinical, as if she were recounting someone else's experiences. The fourth master was worse. Stop! Darius's voice was rough with suppressed emotion. You don't have to tell me everything. Not unless you want to. Elena looked up at him, seeing pain and rage warring in his expression. Not rage at her, she realized with surprise, but rage for her, on her behalf. Aren't you disgusted? She asked. Don't you want to know what they did to your precious lost princess? I want to know if telling me will help you heal or just reopen wounds that are trying to close, Darius said carefully. And I want you to know that nothing you could tell me would change how I see you. Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the judgment or revision she'd learned to expect. Instead, she saw only steady acceptance and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel simultaneously safe and terrified. The last master was the worst, she said, testing the waters. Lord Blackwood. He bought me specifically because he'd heard I was resistant to training. He saw it as a challenge. What happened to him? The question surprised Elena with its calm directness. He died 3 months ago, some kind of wasting illness that the healers couldn't cure. Elena paused, remembering the satisfaction she'd felt when she'd watched him waste away. I wasn't sorry. Good. Darius's response was immediate and uncompromising. If he were still alive, I'd kill him myself. Elena felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but expanding. Room for feelings she'd thought were permanently crushed. You mean that? I mean that. Darius reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, He took her hands in his. Elena, whatever was done to you, whatever you had to endure, it doesn't define you. It's part of your story, but it's not the whole story. Elena stared down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt to be touched with gentleness instead of ownership. Sometimes I feel like it is the whole story, like the girl in those paintings died 17 years ago, and what came back is just a ghost wearing her face. Then I'll love the ghost too, Darius said simply. I'll love whatever you are and whoever you become. Elena felt tears threatening again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. I don't know how to do this, Darius. I don't know how to be in a relationship where someone actually cares about my well-being. We'll figure it out together. There's no timeline, no pressure, no expectations beyond what we create for ourselves. Elena nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Can I ask you something? Anything. The castle, the way you rebuilt it, it's different, harder, more like a fortress than a home. Elena looked around the library, noting the subtle defensive elements that had been incorporated into its design. What happened after I was taken, beyond just my disappearance? Darius was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to tell her. The attack wasn't random, he said finally. It was orchestrated by someone who wanted to destabilize our kingdom by removing its future queen and breaking its future king. Did you find out who? Eventually, it took years of investigation, but we tracked the conspiracy back to a coalition of rival kingdoms who saw our growing power as a threat. Darius's expression hardened. They thought that taking you would make me weak, distracted, easy to manipulate. And did it? For a while, yes, but not in the way they expected. Darius met her eyes. Instead of making me pliable, losing you made me ruthless. I eliminated every threat to our borders, crushed every hint of rebellion, made it clear that crossing me would result in complete annihilation. Elena studied his face, seeing the hard edges that 17 years of kingship had carved into features that had once been softer. What did you do to the ones who ordered my capture? Darius's smile was sharp enough to cut. They learned that some mistakes have permanent consequences. Elena should have been disturbed by the casual way he spoke of what was obviously systematic revenge. Instead, she felt a fierce satisfaction that made her wolf. Yes, she could sense the creature now, no longer buried but not quite awakened either, purr with approval. How many people did you kill? Enough, Elena nodded, understanding filling the spaces between his words. And the castle? The changes? I rebuilt it to be impregnable. No one will ever again be able to take what's mine. Darius's eyes met hers. If you decide to stay, if you choose to be with me, you'll be protected by walls that could withstand a siege and guards who would die before letting harm come to you. Elena felt the weight of that promise settling around her like armor. For 17 years, she'd been property to be traded, used, discarded when convenient. The idea of being something precious enough to be protected felt revolutionary. And if I choose not to stay, then I'll make sure you have everything you need to build whatever life you want, wherever you want to build it. Darius's voice was steady, though she could see the cost of making that promise in his eyes. Your freedom is absolute, Elena. Always. Elena sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything he'd told her. Outside the library windows, she could see the castle grounds bustling with activity, guards training, servants going about their duties, a world that had continued turning during her absence and somehow made space for her return. I want to see the rest of the castle, she said finally. I want to remember what it was like before, understand what it's become since. Of course, would you like me to show you around, or would you prefer to explore on your own? Elena considered the question carefully. Part of her craved the independence of exploring alone, of rediscovering her home without the weight of observation. But another part, the part that was slowly beginning to trust again, wanted his company, his perspective on how the castle had evolved. Together, she said, if you have time. Darius's smile was answer enough. They spent the morning walking through corridors that held layers of memory and change. The great hall where Elena had attended formal dinners as a child was now primarily used for receiving foreign dignitaries. its warm family atmosphere replaced by the calculated grandeur of political theater. The music room where she'd struggled through piano lessons had been converted into additional office space, though Darius assured her the piano was safely stored should she want it returned. But it was the gardens that affected Elena most profoundly. The sprawling grounds that had once been her playground were now divided into functional sections: training yards for the guards, practical herb gardens for the kitchens, defensive positions that could be used in case of siege. The wild flower meadows where she'd spent hours reading and dreaming had been replaced by carefully planned landscapes that prioritized strategic visibility over natural beauty. "It's so different," Elena said quietly, standing in what had once been her favorite spot under an ancient oak tree. The tree was still there, but it was now surrounded by weapon racks and archery targets. "I'm sorry," Darius said, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "After the attack, I prioritized security over sentiment. I can have it changed back, if you'd like." Elena shook her head slowly. "No, this is what the castle needed to become to survive. I understand that." But understanding didn't make the loss any less painful. The gardens had been where she'd felt most like herself, where the formality of court life had melted away, and she'd been free to simply exist. Seeing them transformed into instruments of war was like looking at her own transformation from princess to slave, necessary for survival, but costly in ways that couldn't be measured. "There is one place I kept exactly as it was," Darius said softly. "If you'd like to see it." Elena followed him through a gate she didn't remember, down a winding path that led to a small, secluded garden hidden behind high walls. As soon as she stepped inside, Elena felt her breath catch. It was perfect. The small space was exactly as she remembered it. Wild roses climbing trellises, a small pond with lily pads and goldfish, stone benches placed to catch both morning and evening light. Butterflies danced among the flowers, and the air hummed with the drowsy sound of bees going about their ancient work. "My secret garden," Elena whispered, using the name she'd given the space as a child. "I had the walls reinforced and guards stationed outside the perimeter. But inside I couldn't bear to change anything." Darius moved to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I used to come here when the searching became too much, when I needed to remember why I couldn't give up." Elena walked deeper into the garden, her fingers trailing over surfaces that welcomed her touch. This was the one place in the castle that still felt like home, the one space that remembered the girl she'd been and welcomed the woman she'd become without judgment. "Thank you," she said, turning to face Darius, "for keeping this, for keeping some part of my childhood alive." "It wasn't just for you," Darius admitted. "It was for me too. This garden was the only place where I could still feel close to the boy I'd been before everything went wrong." Elena understood. The garden existed outside of time, a pocket of innocence preserved against all odds. Standing here, she could almost believe that 17 years of suffering had been just a bad dream, that she could step back into the girl she'd been and pick up the life that had been interrupted. But she was no longer that girl, and he was no longer that boy. The question was whether the people they'd become could find their way back to each other despite everything that had changed. "Will you tell me about the boy you were?" Elena asked impulsively. "Before you became the Iron King." Darius looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What you dreamed about, what you were afraid of, what made you laugh." Elena settled onto one of the stone benches, patting the space beside her. "I lost 17 years of knowing you. I want to understand how that laughing boy became the man standing in front of me." Darius sat beside her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd been brave enough. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I was going to be a scholar," he said finally. "Did you know that? Before Father died, before I had to become king, I was planning to study ancient languages and history. I wanted to understand how civilizations rose and fell, what made some kingdoms endure while others crumbled." Elena tried to reconcile this image with the hardened warrior king she'd met in the slave market. "What changed your mind?" "Reality. The attack that took you also killed my parents and most of the royal council. I inherited a throne at 15 with enemies circling like vultures and a kingdom that was hemorrhaging stability. Darius picked up a fallen rose petal, turning it over in his fingers. I learned to be ruthless because the alternative was watching everything I cared about burn. Do you regret it, becoming someone harder than you planned to be? Darius considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret the choices I made. They kept the kingdom safe, kept our people fed and protected, and ultimately led me back to you. Elena studied his profile, seeing the weight of 17 years of difficult decisions etched into the lines around his eyes. What about happiness? Did you ever allow yourself to be happy? Happiness felt like betrayal when you were suffering somewhere I couldn't find you, Darius said quietly. How could I laugh when I didn't know if you were even alive? How could I enjoy music or art or simple pleasures when every moment of my comfort might be built on your pain? Elena felt her chest tighten with emotion. That's not living, Darius. That's just existing. Existing was enough, as long as it meant I could keep searching for you. Elena reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. The touch sent familiar sparks through her system, but this time she didn't pull away. I'm here now, she said simply, and I want you to be happy, both of us. We've both earned the right to cheer after surviving what we've survived. Darius turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. Can you be happy, Elena, after everything you've endured? Elena looked around the secret garden, feeling the peace of the space settle into her bones. For the first time in 17 years, she wasn't calculating escape routes or assessing threats. She was simply sitting in beautiful surroundings with someone who cared about her well-being, free to come and go as she pleased. I think I'm learning how, she said honestly. It's going to take time. There are still moments when I forget that I'm allowed to want things, that expressing preferences won't be punished. But here, with you, she squeezed his hand gently. Here I can remember what peace feels like. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching butterflies dance among the roses and listening to the quiet sounds of a garden in full bloom. Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the luxury of being present in a moment without worrying about what would come next. Eventually, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their tranquility. Marcus appeared at the garden entrance, his expression apologetic but urgent. Your Majesty, he said, bowing slightly. Forgive the interruption, but there are matters requiring your attention. The delegation from the Northern Territories has arrived earlier than expected. Darius sighed, clearly reluctant to leave. Duty calls, I'm afraid. Will you be all right on your own for a few hours? Elena nodded, though she felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of being alone in the castle. I think I'll stay here for a while. This garden, it helps me remember who I used to be. Take all the time you need, and Elena? Darius stood, but paused before leaving. Tonight, would you join me for dinner? Just the two of us. I'd like to continue our conversation when I'm not being summoned away by diplomatic crises. I'd like that, Elena said, meaning it more than she'd expected to. After Darius left, Elena remained in the garden for another hour, simply absorbing the peace of the space and trying to process everything she'd learned about the man her childhood companion had become. The boy who dreamed of being a scholar had been forged into a king by necessity and loss, but traces of his gentler nature survived in places like this hidden garden, and the patient way he'd answered her questions. As the afternoon light began to slant through the trees, Elena finally made her way back toward the castle proper. She was approaching the main building when she heard voices coming from one of the side courtyards. Not the casual conversation of servants going about their duties, but something more heated and argumentative. Curiosity overcoming caution, Elena moved closer to listen. Complete folly to bring her back here, a man's voice was saying, sharp with barely controlled anger. After 17 years, she's not the same person. She's been broken, corrupted, turned into something we can't trust. Lord Aldrich, another voice replied, and Elena recognized Marcus's diplomatic tone stretched thin with patience. His Majesty's personal relationships are not subject to council review. His personal relationships become our concern when they threaten the stability of the kingdom, Lord Aldrich replied. That woman spent 17 years as a slave. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? What kind of damage it causes? Elena pressed herself against the stone wall, her heart hammering as she listened to strangers debate her worth and trustworthiness. Furthermore, Lord Aldrich continued, we have no verification of her identity beyond His Majesty's emotional recognition. For all we know, she could be a spy, a plant sent by our enemies to exploit the king's well-known weakness regarding his lost mate. That's enough. Marcus's voice carried a warning that made Elena shiver. Princess Elena's identity has been confirmed through multiple means, and questioning her legitimacy borders on treason. Does it? Or does it border on common sense? Lord Aldrich's footsteps paced closer to Elena's hiding spot. The timing is suspicious, Marcus. Just when we're negotiating new trade agreements with 3 kingdoms, when our position has never been stronger, suddenly the perfect tool to manipulate our king walks back into our lives. Elena felt ice forming in her veins. The man was voicing doubts that she'd harbored herself. How convenient was it that she'd been found just when Darius had finally achieved the stability he'd fought for? How could anyone be certain she was who she appeared to be after 17 years of systematic degradation? I've known Elena since she was 3 years old, Marcus said firmly. I would stake my life on her identity. You may be staking all our lives on it, Lord Aldrich replied grimly. Mark my words, Marcus. That woman will be the death of everything we've built. The king's judgment is compromised where she's concerned, and we'll all pay the price for his blindness. Elena had heard enough. She slipped away from the wall and back toward the castle, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd overheard. Lord Aldrich's suspicions weren't entirely unreasonable. She was asking them to trust someone whose identity rested primarily on emotional recognition and childhood memories that could potentially be fabricated. More troubling was his assessment of the damage her years in captivity had caused. Elena knew better than anyone how those experiences had changed her, how they twisted her understanding of normal human relationships and left her with reflexes that were more suited to survival than civilization. What if he was right? What if she was broken beyond repair, a danger to the kingdom and the man she was slowly learning to care about again? Elena made it back to her tower room before the familiar panic attack hit her. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her vision tunneled, and her hands shook as she gripped the window frame for support. The voices in her head, not Lord Aldrich's, but those of her former masters, began their familiar chorus of degradation and doubt. You're nothing. You're worthless. You're poison to everything you touch. He'll realize his mistake soon enough. They always do. You think you can play at being a princess? You're a slave. That's all you've ever been, all you'll ever be, Hajim. Elena slid to her knees on the stone floor, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations she didn't know how to meet and doubts that felt more real than the comfort surrounding her. Maybe Lord Aldrich was right. Maybe she was a danger to everything Darius had built. Maybe the kindest thing she could do would be to disappear again before she had the chance to destroy the life he'd created in her absence. Elena's panic attack lasted nearly an hour, leaving her drained and shaky on the cold stone floor of her tower room. When her breathing finally steadied and the crushing weight on her chest began to lift, she found herself staring at one of the painted portraits. Herself at age 6, laughing as she tried to braid flowers into Darius's hair, while he sat patiently still for her childish ministrations. The girl in that painting had never questioned her worth, never wondered if her very existence was a burden to those around her. She had been loved completely and without reservation, secure in the knowledge that she belonged exactly where she was. Elena couldn't remember what that kind of certainty felt like. A soft knock at her door made her scramble to her feet, hastily smoothing her dress and wiping the tear tracks from her cheeks. "Come in," she called, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Sarah entered with her usual gentle smile, carrying what looked like a jewelry box made of polished silver. "Your Majesty, I thought you might like to see these. King Darius asked me to bring them up from the royal vault." Elena accepted the box with trembling hands, noting how the elaborate engravings on its surface depicted scenes of wolves running through moonlit forests. Inside, nestled on beds of midnight blue velvet, lay pieces of jewelry that took her breath away. Not because of their obvious value, though the diamonds and sapphires were clearly worth a fortune, but because she recognized them. "My mother's jewelry," Elena whispered, lifting a delicate necklace that seemed to capture starlight in its crystal pendants. Queen Isabella's personal collection, Sarah confirmed. King Darius had everything preserved in the royal vault after the attack. He said you should have them when you were ready. Elena's fingers traced the familiar pieces, each one awakening memories she'd thought were lost forever. The ruby earrings her mother had worn to state dinners, the silver bracelet that had been a gift from Elena's father on their wedding anniversary, the sapphire ring that had been passed down through 5 generations of queens. I remember this one, Elena said, picking up a simple pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Mother used to say it would protect me in the darkness. Sarah's eyes grew soft with sympathy. Perhaps it did, Your Majesty. Perhaps it protected the part of you that needed to survive until you could come home. Elena clasped the pendant around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of it settle against her collarbone. For a moment, she could almost hear her mother's voice, gentle and loving as she explained the old stories behind each piece of jewelry. Sarah, Elena said suddenly, what do you know about Lord Aldrich? The maid's expression grew cautious. He's one of the king's senior advisors, Your Majesty, a member of the Royal Council. That's not what I meant. Elena set the jewelry box aside and studied Sarah's face. What kind of man is he? What does he believe in? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to say. Lord Aldrich is practical, Your Majesty. He believes in order, stability, and making decisions based on logic rather than emotion. He was instrumental in helping King Darius consolidate power after the attack. And what does he think of my return? Your Majesty, I'm not sure it's my place to— Please, Elena interrupted. I need to understand what I'm facing here. I overheard him talking to Marcus earlier, and it's clear he has concerns about my presence in the castle. Sarah sighed, settling into the chair across from Elena. Lord Aldrich is worried that your return will make the king vulnerable. He's seen how much effort His Majesty put into searching for you over the years, how it consumed him at times. Lord Aldrich believes that emotional attachments make rulers weak. Does he think I'm a small? Sarah's hesitation was answer enough. He questions your identity, Sarah said carefully. Not because he doubts your legitimacy, but because he doesn't trust that 17 years of captivity haven't changed your loyalties. Elena felt a familiar cold settle in her stomach. And what do you think? Sarah met her eyes directly. I think Lord Aldrich is a man who's forgotten that love can make people stronger rather than weaker. And I think anyone who's survived what you've survived and still capable of gentleness has the kind of strength kingdoms are built on. Before Elena could respond, another knock echoed through the room. This time it was Marcus who entered, his expression grave. Princess Elena, he said formally, then glanced at Sarah. Would you excuse us, please? I need to speak with Her Majesty privately. Sarah curtsied and left, but not before giving Elena an encouraging smile that helped steady her nerves. Marcus waited until they were alone before moving to stand by the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose Elena remembered from childhood lectures about proper behavior and royal responsibility. You overheard the conversation in the courtyard, he said without preamble. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was just walking back from the gardens and you have nothing to apologize for. Marcus turned to face her, his green eyes kind but serious. In fact, it's probably better that you know what you're dealing with. Lord Aldrich isn't your only skeptic on the council. Elena's heart sank. How many of them question my identity? 3 out of 7 have voiced concerns. Not about whether you're truly Elena Ashford. The physical resemblance and your knowledge of childhood details make that undeniable. But about whether the woman who returned is someone we can trust with the kingdom's security. Elena sank into her chair, feeling the weight of political reality settling on her shoulders. They think I've been compromised. They think 17 years of slavery might have created loyalties or dependencies that could be exploited by enemies of the crown. Marcus moved to sit across from her, his expression gentle but unflinching. They're not entirely wrong to be concerned, Elena. That kind of systematic psychological manipulation can have lasting effects. The honesty hurt. But Elena appreciated it more than empty reassurances would have. So what do I do? You prove them wrong. You show them that whatever was done to you, whatever you had to endure, you're still fundamentally the same person at your core. The girl who cared more about justice than personal comfort. The princess who sneaked food to the kitchen cats, even when she was told it would make them lazy. Elena felt tears threatening again. What if I'm not that person anymore? What if Lord Aldrich is right and I'm just a broken shell of what I used to be? Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm with conviction. Elena, in the past 24 hours, you've shown more courage than most people display in a lifetime. You trusted Darius enough to come home with him. You faced your past without flinching. You've allowed yourself to be vulnerable with people who could hurt you, despite every lesson captivity taught you about self-protection. That doesn't make me trustworthy. It might just make me naive. Or it might make you exactly what this kingdom needs. Someone who remembers that strength and gentleness aren't mutually exclusive. Marcus paused, studying her face. Elena, may I ask you something personal? Elena nodded. In all your years of captivity, did you ever betray someone who trusted you? Did you ever choose your own safety at the expense of someone weaker? Elena thought about the question carefully. There had been moments when she could have curried favor with masters by reporting the small rebellions of other slaves. Times when cooperation might have earned her better treatment at the cost of others' suffering. No, she said finally, I never did. Then you're still the same person where it matters most. Everything else, the wariness, the self-doubt, the defensive reflexes, those are just scars. They don't define your character. Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Marcus had always been able to see through her fears to the person underneath, even when she couldn't see it herself. What should I expect from the council? Caution, formal politeness that barely conceals suspicion, questions designed to test your loyalty and judgment. Marcus's expression grew apologetic, and probably some attempts to manipulate Darius through you to see if you can be used as leverage against him. Elena felt a flash of anger at the thought. If anyone tries to use me to hurt him, there's the Elena I remember, Marcus said with satisfaction. That fierce protectiveness, that instinctive defense of the people you love. Hold on to that feeling, because it's going to be your greatest asset in the political battles ahead. Political battles, is that what this is going to be? Elena, you're the potential future queen of the most powerful werewolf kingdom in the known world. Everything about your life is political now, whether you want it to be or not. Marcus stood, moving back toward the window. The question is whether you'll let politics shape you, or whether you'll shape politics to serve your values. Elena absorbed this. Feeling the weight of responsibility settling around her like a cloak. She'd spent 17 years learning to make herself small and unnoticed. The idea of stepping into a role that required visibility and influence felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Does Darius know about the council's concerns? He knows. He's choosing to ignore them for now, which is causing its own tensions. Marcus met her eyes. Elena, I need you to understand something. Darius has spent 17 years building this kingdom into something powerful enough to protect what he loves. But that power has come at a price. He's made enemies, created obligations, entered into alliances that require careful maintenance. And my presence threatens that stability. Your presence changes the equation. Some of those changes will be positive. Having a queen will strengthen certain alliances and provide stability for the succession. But other changes will create new vulnerabilities, new ways for enemies to attack what matters most to him. Elena stood and moved to one of the painted portraits, studying the carefree child who had never had to think about political ramifications of her existence. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been kinder if he'd never found me, she said quietly. Elena. Marcus's voice was sharp enough to make her turn around to her. Don't you dare start thinking that way. Why not? Lord Aldrich isn't wrong. I am damaged. I do carry risks, and Darius has been happy, or at least stable, without me for 17 years. Darius has been existing without you for 17 years. There's a difference. Marcus crossed the room to stand beside her. Do you know what he was like in the first year after you were taken? Elena shook her head. He barely ate, barely slept. He would spend days in the saddle searching for you, coming back half dead from exhaustion, only to collapse for a few hours before riding out again. We had to physically restrain him from leading increasingly dangerous rescue missions based on rumors and whispers. Elena felt her chest tighten at the image. It took years for him to find a balance between searching for you and ruling the kingdom. Even then, he never stopped, never gave up, never even considered taking another mate. Marcus's voice grew soft with memory. Elena, I watched that boy become a man while carrying a grief that should have destroyed him. The only thing that kept him functional was the belief that someday, somehow, he would find you again. But what if finding me destroys everything he built while I was gone? Then we'll build something better. Marcus's response was immediate and confident. Something that includes both of you, that draws strength from your bond rather than being weakened by it. Elena wanted to believe him, but the practical part of her mind, the part that had been honed by years of calculating survival odds, kept circling back to the risks. Marcus, what if I'm not strong enough for this? What if the council is right and I am just a liability? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him choosing his words carefully. Elena, strength isn't about never being broken. It's about how you put yourself back together after breaking. He gestured toward the paintings around them. That little girl in those pictures never faced real hardship, never had to make impossible choices or endure systematic cruelty. She was innocent and sheltered and utterly unprepared for the realities of the world. Elena nodded, seeing the truth in his words. But the woman standing in front of me has survived things that would have killed that little girl. You've learned to be resilient, resourceful, and absolutely refusing to give up even when hope seemed impossible. Marcus's voice grew firm with conviction. Those aren't the qualities of a liability, Elena. Those are the qualities of a queen. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Heavy boots, multiple people, moving with military precision. Marcus frowned, moving toward the door. That sounds like... The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Darius flanked by two guards. His face was grim, his golden eyes holding a hardness that Elena hadn't seen since the slave market. We need to leave, he said without preamble. Now. What's happened? Marcus demanded, but he was already moving toward the wardrobe where Elena's traveling clothes were stored. Scouts report an army moving toward our borders from the east. Black banners, no identifiable heraldry. Darius's voice was clipped, efficient. They'll be here within 2 days. Elena felt ice form in her veins. Because of me? Darius's expression softened slightly as he met her eyes. We don't know yet, but I'm not taking any chances with your safety. Where are we going? The Northern Stronghold. It's defensible, and we have allies there who won't ask questions. Darius moved to the jewelry box, scooping the contents into a leather pouch. Pack only what you can carry. We leave within the hour. Elena's mind raced. An unknown army moving towards Shadowmere just days after her return couldn't be a coincidence. Whether they were coming specifically for her or simply taking advantage of what they perceived as a moment of weakness in Darius's rule, her presence had clearly triggered something. This is my fault, she said quietly. This is the fault of whoever's leading that army, Darius corrected firmly. You didn't choose to be taken 17 years ago. And you didn't choose to attract the attention of our enemies now. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Elena could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already strategizing, already planning for a war that her return had precipitated. Lord Aldrich had been right about one thing. Her presence did make Darius vulnerable. It gave his enemies a target they could use against him, a weakness they could exploit. As Elena hastily packed the few belongings she'd acquired since her return, she made a silent vow. Whatever was coming, whoever was threatening the kingdom because of her, she wouldn't be a passive victim this time. She'd spent 17 years having her fate decided by others. If enemies were coming for her, they would find that the broken slave girl they expected had become something far more dangerous. They would find a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The ride to the Northern Stronghold took 3 days of hard travel through terrain that grew increasingly wild and unforgiving with each mile they covered. Elena had never been this far from the capital, and despite the circumstances that had driven them from Shadowmere, she found herself fascinated by the changing landscape. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests of pine and oak, their canopies so thick they blocked out much of the sun and created a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. Streams ran cold and clear between moss-covered rocks, and the air carried scents of earth and growing things that awakened something primal in Elena's blood. Her wolf, which had been stirring restlessly since her return to Shadowmere, seemed to grow stronger the further they traveled into the wilderness. Sometimes Elena caught herself lifting her face to catch wind-borne scents she shouldn't have been able to detect, or noticing sounds that were too distant for human ears. "She's waking up," Darius observed on the second evening as they made camp in a sheltered grove. He'd been watching Elena track the movement of a deer through the underbrush with predatory focus. "Who?" "Your wolf, the part of you that was suppressed during captivity." Darius settled beside her on the fallen log that served as their makeshift seat. "I can sense her growing stronger." Elena considered this, testing the awareness that had been building inside her. "It feels strange, like remembering a language I used to speak fluently but haven't used in years." The silver they use to suppress shifter abilities in the slave markets has a lingering effect. It takes time for the body to purge it completely. Darius poked at their small campfire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up into the darkening sky. "But being back among your own kind, in wild places, it accelerates the healing process." Elena nodded, though part of her wondered if it was wise to let her wolf emerge while so much else in her life remained uncertain. The creature stirring inside her felt powerful but unpredictable, like a force she might not be able to control once it was fully awakened. "Darius," she said quietly, "tell me about the Northern Stronghold. What should I expect?" "It's not like Shadowmere. The architecture is older, more primitive, built for defense rather than comfort." Darius's voice took on the tone he used when discussing military matters. "It's commanded by Lord Commander Thane Blackwood, one of my most trusted allies." Elena's blood went cold. "Blackwood?" Darius turned to look at her, noting the sudden tension in her posture. "Elena, what is it?" "Lord Blackwood, my last master. His name was Lord Garrett Blackwood." Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You said he died 3 months ago of a wasting illness." Darius went perfectly still. Garrett Blackwood was Thane's younger brother. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The Northern Stronghold, the place Darius had chosen as their refuge, was commanded by the brother of the man who had spent months systematically breaking her down to nothing. "Elena," Darius's voice was carefully controlled, "what exactly did Garrett Blackwood do to you?" Elena closed her eyes, trying to push away memories that threatened to drag her back into that dark place. "He specialized in psychological torture. He bought me specifically because he'd heard I was resistant to training. He saw it as a personal challenge." She felt Darius go rigid beside her, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "He would—" Elena's voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "He would build me up, show me kindness, make me believe I was safe. Then he would tear it all away, usually in front of an audience. He wanted to prove that anyone could be broken completely if you just found the right pressure points." "Did he succeed?" The question was asked so quietly Elena almost didn't hear it. "For a while, yes." Elena opened her eyes, staring into the flames of their campfire. "There were days when I would have done anything he asked, said anything he wanted to hear, just to make the psychological game stop. He was very good at finding ways to make hope hurt worse than despair." Darius was silent for a long moment, and Elena could practically feel the rage radiating from him in waves. "We'll turn back," he said finally. "Find another route, another safe house." "No." Elena's response surprised them both with its firmness. "I won't let the ghost of Garrett Blackwood dictate our strategy. If Thane is truly your ally, then we continue north." "Elena, you don't understand. Thane doesn't know that his brother owned you. If he did, if he learned what Garrett did—" Darius ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with the implications. "Thane loved his brother, despite Garrett's flaws. He might not react well to meeting the woman whose presence coincided with his brother's death." Elena felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. "Are you suggesting I'm responsible for Garrett's death?" "I'm suggesting that Thane might see it that way, especially if he learns about the timing." Darius met her eyes. Elena, Garrett died exactly 2 weeks after you were put up for sale at the Ravencrest market. That's not a coincidence anyone would overlook. Elena stared at him, processing the implications. You think I somehow caused his illness? I think there are forces at work here that we don't understand. Powers that might have been protecting you in ways you weren't aware of. Darius's voice grew thoughtful. The bad luck that followed you from master to master, the way your former owners would develop sudden reversals of fortune or mysterious ailments. You think I'm cursed? I think you might be blessed, in a way that your enemies experienced as cursing. Darius leaned forward, his golden eyes intense in the firelight. Elena, what do you know about your mother's family line? Elena frowned, trying to remember details that had seemed unimportant during her sheltered childhood. She came from the eastern provinces. Her family had some minor noble title, but they weren't particularly wealthy or powerful. What else? There were stories about her grandmother. Something about her having unusual gifts, being able to sense things others couldn't. Elena's frown deepened as half-remembered conversations surfaced. But I always thought they were just family legends, the kind of stories people tell to make their ancestors sound more interesting. Darius was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Elena, your mother's bloodline carries traces of something very old and very rare. Most people would call it witchcraft, though that's not entirely accurate. What are you talking about? The ability to influence fate, to turn luck itself into a weapon or a shield. It's not conscious magic. Most people who carry the gift never even realize they have it. But in times of extreme stress or danger, it can manifest as what appears to be supernatural protection. Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. You're saying I've been unconsciously cursing my masters? I'm saying you've been unconsciously protecting yourself from them. The curse wasn't on you, it was on anyone who tried to harm you. Darius reached out to take her hand. It explains why you survived when other slaves in your position died, why your masters eventually grew tired of the problems that followed owning you, why Garrett Blackwood died within weeks of your sale. Elena pulled her hand away, disturbed by the implications. If that's true, if I really do carry some kind of inherited curse, then everyone around me is in danger. You, Marcus, the people at Shadowmere. Only those who mean you harm. Darius's voice was calm, certain. Elena, I've been around you for days now, and nothing but good fortune has followed. The same is true for Marcus, for Sarah, for everyone who's treated you with kindness. But Thane Blackwood, Thane has never met you. He has no reason to wish you ill unless someone gives him one. Darius stood, beginning to pace around their small campsite. Which is why we're going to be completely honest with him about who you are and what his brother did to you. Elena felt panic rising in her chest. Darius, no. If this man loved his brother, then he deserves to know the truth about what kind of man Garrett really was. Darius's voice was firm. Elena, we can't build trust on a foundation of lies, and we can't let fear of other people's reactions control our choices. Elena wanted to argue, but she could see the wisdom in his words. Still, the thought of facing the brother of her tormentor, of having to relive those memories in front of someone who might blame her for Garrett's death, made her stomach churn with anxiety. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he thinks I'm lying to justify whatever I did to his brother? Then we'll deal with that if it happens. Darius returned to sit beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Elena, I know this is frightening, but running from the truth won't make it less real, and it won't make you safer in the long run. Elena nodded reluctantly, recognizing the logic even as every instinct screamed at her to flee rather than confront the past. They reached the northern stronghold late the following evening, their horses stumbling with exhaustion after the final climb through mountain passes that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The fortress that greeted them looked like something from an earlier, more brutal age. Massive walls of dark stone topped with iron spikes, towers that rose like accusing fingers against the star-filled sky. But there was something beautiful about it too, Elena realized as they approached the main gates. The architecture was honest in its purpose, without the decorative elements that might disguise its violent intent. It was a place built by people who understood that survival sometimes required harsh choices. Your Majesty! The guards who met them at the gates wore armor that looked like it had seen real battle, their faces bearing scars that spoke of experience rather than mere training. Lord Commander Thane is waiting for you in the Great Hall. Elena's anxiety spiked as they dismounted and made their way into the fortress. The corridors were narrower than those at Shadowmere, lit by torches rather than the elegant crystal fixtures she'd grown accustomed to. Everything about the place spoke of functionality over comfort. The Great Hall was dominated by a massive fireplace that cast dancing shadows across stone walls decorated with weapons rather than tapestries. At the head of a long wooden table sat a man who looked like an older, harder version of the brother Elena remembered all too well. Thane Blackwood had the same dark hair and sharp features as Garrett, but where his younger brother had been soft with luxury and cruelty, Thane was all lean muscle and battle-tested strength. His eyes, when they met Elena's across the hall, held a directness that was both reassuring and unsettling. Darius, Thane said, rising to clasp arms with the king and the warriors a greeting. It's good to see you, though I wish the circumstances were better. My scouts confirm the reports. There's definitely an army moving toward your borders. How many? At least 3,000, possibly more. They're moving too fast for a detailed count. Thane's gaze shifted to Elena, and she saw his expression change as he took in her appearance. And this would be the woman who's caused such a stir in political circles. Elena felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. I am Elena Ashford, your lordship. So I've heard, though I understand you've been using a different name for quite some time. Thane's voice was carefully neutral, giving away nothing of his thoughts. Elena glanced at Darius, who gave her an encouraging nod. I was known by many names during my captivity, Lord Commander. Most recently, I was called Vera, property of Lord Garrett Blackwood of the Eastern Territories. The change in Thane's expression was immediate and dramatic. The careful neutrality vanished, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. You knew my brother? I was his slave for 8 months, from last autumn until his death 3 months ago. Elena's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. I was present when he died. Thane was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Tell me about my brother's death. Elena took a deep breath, knowing that everything might depend on how she handled this moment. He became ill very suddenly, about 2 weeks after I was put up for sale at the Ravencrest Market. It started as a simple fever, but it progressed rapidly into something the healers couldn't identify or treat. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. He was delirious toward the end. He kept apologizing for things he'd done, people he'd hurt. I was with him when he died because none of his other servants wanted to stay in the room. You were with him? Elena felt tears threatening, though she wasn't sure if they were for Garrett's suffering or for her own complicated feelings about his death. Because no one should die alone, regardless of what they've done in life. And because, Elena hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Because I wanted to make sure he was really gone. I needed to see it with my own eyes to believe I was finally free. Thane studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. What did my brother do to you? Elena felt Darius move closer beside her, his presence lending her strength. He broke me down systematically over the course of months. Psychological torture designed to destroy my sense of self, my ability to hope, or trust, or believe in anything good. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. He was very skilled at it, and very proud of his techniques. He used to invite guests to watch his progress, to demonstrate how completely a human spirit could be shattered with the right methods. Thane's face had gone very pale, but he didn't interrupt. He told me once that he'd learned his methods from studying with masters in the Far East, men who specialized in breaking the minds of prisoners of war. He said I was his greatest challenge because I'd survived so many previous owners without being completely broken. And did he succeed? Thane's voice was barely above a whisper. Elena considered the question carefully. For a time, yes. There were days when I would have done anything he asked, said anything he wanted to hear, betrayed anyone he named just to make it stop. In that sense, he did break me. But you survived. I survived. And when he became ill, when the fever took him, I felt— Elena paused, struggling to articulate the complex mixture of emotions. I felt sorry for him because I realized that anyone who needed to inflict that kind of suffering on others must be carrying something terrible inside himself. Thane was silent for a long time, staring into the fire as if it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. My brother was not a good man, he said finally. I knew that. I've always known that. But I told myself that his flaws were just youthful excess, that he would grow out of them eventually. Elena said nothing, recognizing that Thane needed to work through his own understanding of who his brother had been. He wrote to me occasionally, told me about his estates, his business dealings, his acquisitions. Thane's voice grew heavy with disgust. I should have realized what he meant by that last category. Should have investigated, should have stopped him. You couldn't have known, Elena started, but Thane held up a hand. I could have known if I'd wanted to know. But it was easier to pretend that my little brother was just eccentric rather than face the truth about what he'd become. Thane met Elena's eyes directly. I failed you, Princess Elena. I failed everyone who suffered at his hands because I chose willful blindness over difficult truth. Elena felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. You weren't responsible for his choices, Lord Commander, and you can't save people from evils you don't know exist. Perhaps not, but I can ensure that his victims know they have an advocate now. Thane stood, his bearing formal and military. Princess Elena, I offer you my sword and my protection, not just as a subject of the crown, but as someone who owes a debt that can never be fully repaid. Elena felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than pain. Thank you, Lord Commander. That means more than you know. Thane nodded, then turned to address Darius. Now, about this army heading toward your borders. My scouts report they're flying black banners with silver crescents. That's the sigil of the Shadow Brotherhood. Elena felt ice form in her veins at the name. She'd heard whispers of the Shadow Brotherhood during her captivity. Mercenaries and assassins who took contracts that other fighters wouldn't touch, who specialized in eliminating problems that couldn't be solved through conventional warfare. Why would the Shadow Brotherhood be moving against Shadowmere? Darius asked. But Elena could see that he already suspected the answer. Because someone has offered them enough gold to risk taking on the most powerful Alpha King in the known world. Thane's expression was grim. The question is, who has that kind of wealth and that kind of hatred? Elena cleared her throat softly. Lord Commander, if I may, during my time in captivity, I heard rumors about the Shadow Brotherhood. They don't just take contracts for gold, they also take them for other considerations. What kind of considerations? Elena met Darius's eyes, seeing her own fear reflected in his golden gaze. The kind that involves settling very old debts. The kind that someone might pay if they wanted revenge for something that happened 17 years ago. The implication hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Someone connected to Elena's original captors was still alive, still seeking vengeance, and now they had an army of legendary killers to help them claim it. Elena slept poorly that night despite the comfortable bed in Thane's fortress. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in the dark corridors of Garrett Blackwood's estate, hearing his cultured voice explaining the finer points of psychological manipulation while she hung in chains that had rubbed her wrists raw. But this time, in the dreams, Garrett wasn't alone. Shadowy figures stood behind him, watching with approval as he demonstrated his techniques. Figures whose faces she couldn't quite make out, but whose presence filled her with a terror that went deeper than anything she'd experienced during her waking captivity. She woke before dawn, drenched in sweat and shaking, the taste of copper in her mouth from where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. Elena! Darius's voice came from the chair beside her bed, rough with concern and lack of sleep. Another nightmare? Elena sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around herself like armor. They're getting more vivid, more specific. Tell me. Elena looked at him in the pre-dawn darkness, seeing the exhaustion in his golden eyes. He'd been keeping watch over her sleep for hours, she realized, probably listening to her whimper and thrash through dreams he couldn't enter or ease. I keep seeing Garrett, but he's not alone. There are others with him, people I can't quite see clearly, but who feel. Elena struggled to find words for the sensation. Ancient, powerful, like they've been waiting in a very long time for something. Waiting for what? Me. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. In the dreams, they're always waiting for me. Darius moved from the chair to sit on the edge of her bed, careful not to touch her without permission, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Elena nodded, though her stomach clenched with apprehension. During your captivity, did anyone ever ask you questions about your family? About your mother's bloodline specifically? Elena frowned, sifting through 17 years of fragmented memories. Most masters didn't care about slave backgrounds, but she paused, remembering something she'd buried deep. Garrett did. He was obsessed with genealogy, with family histories and bloodlines. What did he ask you? He wanted to know about my mother's family, particularly her grandmother. He said he'd researched my background before purchasing me, that he knew I came from interesting stock. Elena's frown deepened as more details surfaced. He had books about hereditary magic, about bloodlines that carried supernatural abilities. I thought it was just another way to torment me, making me think I was somehow responsible for the misfortunes that followed me. Darius went very still. Elena, what exactly did he tell you about your family? He said my great-grandmother had been what he called a fate weaver, someone who could influence probability and luck through unconscious magic. He claimed that the abilities sometimes skipped generations, lying dormant until triggered by extreme stress. Elena felt ice forming in her veins as the implications became clear. He was trying to activate whatever power I might have inherited, wasn't he? The psychological torture, the systematic breaking down of my defenses. It was all designed to trigger a magical awakening. That would explain why he was so methodical about it, why he documented everything so carefully. Darius's voice was grim. Elena, I think Garrett was working for someone else. Someone who wanted you specifically because of your bloodline. Before Elena could respond, urgent voices echoed from the corridor outside. Heavy footsteps, the clank of armor, the sharp tones of men delivering bad news. Darius was on his feet instantly, moving toward the door with the fluid grace of a predator. Elena followed, wrapping a robe around herself as they stepped into the hallway. Thane was already there, fully dressed despite the early hour, speaking in low tones with a scout who looked like he'd ridden hard through the night. How close? Thane was asking as they approached. Half a day's march, Lord Commander. Maybe less if they push through without stopping. The scout's face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion. And sir, there's something else. They're not alone. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. What do you mean? Darius demanded. There's someone traveling with them. Someone different. The horses won't go near wherever this person is camped. Even our war horses, the ones trained to charge into battle without flinching, they panic at the scent. Elena's wolf, which had been growing stronger over the past few days, suddenly went utterly silent inside her. Not dormant, but actively hiding, as if something had terrified it into complete stillness. Could you see who it was? Thane asked. The scout shook his head, too far away and too much shadow around their camp. But Lord Commander, the man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I've been scouting for 15 years. I've tracked everything from rabid bears to rogue wolves. I've never felt anything like the wrongness that comes from that camp. Elena found herself speaking without conscious decision. It's him. Everyone turned to look at her. Him? Darius asked quietly. The one who ordered my original capture. The one who's been pulling strings for 17 years. Elena's voice was steady, though her hands shook. I can feel him, the same way I could feel him in the dreams. He's coming to finish what he started. Elena, Thane said carefully, you can't know that for certain, based on a scout's report. Yes, I can. Elena met his eyes directly. Because my wolf is hiding. She's been getting stronger every day since we left Shadowmere, but now she's curled up inside me like a terrified pup. Whatever's out there, it's powerful enough to frighten a creature that was just starting to remember what it meant to be wild. Darius moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. Then we prepare for the worst and hope for something less catastrophic. His voice took on the tone of absolute command. Thane, what are our defensive options? The fortress can hold against a conventional siege for months. We have supplies, water, defensive positions that have never been breached. Thane paused, glancing at Elena. But if we're dealing with something supernatural, then we adapt. Darius's voice was firm. Elena, you said you felt this presence in your dreams. Was there anything else? Any details that might help us understand what we're facing? Elena closed her eyes, forcing herself to examine memories she'd rather forget. Power that feels old, older than kingdoms, older than the werewolf bloodlines. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. And patience. This thing, whatever it is, it's been waiting for a very long time. 17 years is nothing to something that's existed for centuries. Any sense of what it wants? Elena opened her eyes, meeting Darius's golden gaze with absolute certainty. Me. It wants me specifically. Everything else, the army, the political destabilization, even Garrett's experiments, it's all been leading to this moment. Then it's not going to get you. Darius's voice carried the kind of conviction that made kingdoms follow him into impossible battles. Whatever this thing is, whatever power it commands, it underestimated one crucial factor. What's that? I've had 17 years to prepare for war, and I've spent every one of those years becoming the kind of enemy that nightmares have nightmares about. Elena felt a rush of fierce affection for this man who faced cosmic horrors with the same practical determination he brought to managing trade disputes. Darius, if this creature is as powerful as I think it is, your army might not be enough. Then we'll find another way. Darius turned to Thane. Send word to every ally we have within a day's ride. Call in every favor, activate every treaty. If we're going to make a stand, we're going to make it with overwhelming force. And if overwhelming force isn't enough, Darius looked at Elena and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not fear, but a kind of desperate resolve that spoke of last resort contingencies. Then we make sure that taking Elena costs our enemy everything they have. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. Elena found herself assigned to help coordinate the evacuation of non-essential personnel, servants, supply masters, anyone who couldn't fight and didn't need to stay for the fortress's defense. It was practical work that kept her hands busy, while her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. But as she helped organize supplies and safe passage for the evacuees, Elena became aware of something troubling. People were staring at her, not with the curious interest she'd grown accustomed to, but with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Conversations stopped when she approached, and more than once she caught fragments of whispered speculation that made her stomach churn. Brought this down on us. Never had armies of darkness before she came back. Curse following her around like a pet. Elena tried to ignore the whispers to focus on the tasks that needed completing. But by midday, the weight of accusatory stares had become unbearable. She found herself taking refuge in the fortress's chapel, a small stone room dominated by an altar carved with symbols of protection and blessing. It was empty except for her, Mom. Apparently, even the devout were too busy preparing for war to spare time for prayer. Having second thoughts, Thane's voice came from the doorway behind her. Elena turned to find the Lord Commander studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. About what? About whether coming here was the right choice. About whether you're bringing more danger than protection to the people around you. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. I take it the evacuation isn't going smoothly. The evacuation is going perfectly. People are scared, but they're following orders and getting to safety. Thane moved to sit on the bench beside her. What's not going smoothly is watching you torture yourself with guilt over circumstances beyond your control. Is it beyond my control? These people are fleeing their homes because of me. There's an army of killers approaching because of me. Whatever's coming, I'm the reason it's targeting this place. Elena, may I tell you something about war? Elena nodded. I've been fighting for 20 years. Bandits, rival kingdoms, political rebellions, creatures that shouldn't exist but do anyway. And in all that time, I've learned one crucial truth about blame and responsibility. Thane paused, choosing his words carefully. Wars don't happen because good people exist. They happen because evil people choose to make them happen. You didn't choose to be born into a bloodline with unusual gifts. You didn't choose to be kidnapped as a child. You didn't choose to spend 17 years being systematically tortured by my brother. Elena felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. But I did choose to come back. I chose to let Darius bring me home, knowing that it might put him in danger. Yes, you did. Thane's voice was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. You chose to trust someone who'd been searching for you for 17 years. You chose to believe that you deserve safety and happiness in love. Those aren't selfish choices, Elena. Those are brave ones. Elena was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. The people here, the ones who are looking at me like I'm a plague carrier, they're not wrong to be afraid. I do bring danger with me. So does Darius, so do I, so does anyone worth protecting. Thane stood, moving toward the chapel's single window. Elena, strength draws challenge. Power attracts those who want to steal or destroy it. Love makes people willing to fight harder than they ever thought possible. He turned back to face her. The question isn't whether you're dangerous. Of course you are. The question is whether you're dangerous to the right things. Before Elena could respond, the sound of horns echoed across the fortress. Not the musical calls used for ceremonies, but the harsh, urgent blasts that meant enemy forces had been sighted. Elena and Thane rushed to the battlements, joining the crowd of defenders who were straining to see what approached from the south. At first, Elena could make out only a dark smudge on the horizon, like a storm cloud that had somehow settled onto the ground. But as she watched, the smudge resolved itself into or more terrifying, an army of the dead, not metaphorically, but literally. The Shadow Brotherhood's forces moved with the shambling gait of corpses animated by unnatural will, their armor black with rot and decay, their weapons gleaming with substances that hurt the eyes to look at directly. At their head rode a figure that made Elena's newly awakened wolf whimper with terror. Tall, impossibly gaunt, wrapped in robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood that cast shadows deeper than any natural darkness should allow. But Elena could feel its attention fixed on her like a weight pressing against her soul. Necromancer, Thane breathed beside her. A powerful one, from the look of that army. Elena couldn't speak. The moment she'd laid eyes on the approaching figure, memories had begun flooding back, not from her conscious mind, but from some deeper place where her 7-year-old self had buried trauma too great to bear. She remembered now. The night of the attack, the moment when soldiers had broken down the castle doors and filled the corridors with violence and flame. There had been someone with them, someone who hadn't participated in the fighting but had stood in the shadows, watching with satisfaction as the royal family was butchered and their youngest daughter was dragged away screaming. Someone who had waited 17 years for her to become exactly what he needed her to be. His name is Malachar, Elena whispered, the knowledge rising from depths of memory she hadn't known existed. He's the one who ordered my capture, the one who's been orchestrating everything. Darius appeared at her other side, his face grim as he studied the approaching army. How many? He asked Thane. 3,000, maybe more. All of them dead, which means conventional weapons will have limited effect. Thane's voice was professional, but Elena could hear the underlying tension. We can hold the walls for a while, but eventually they'll overwhelm us through sheer numbers, Darius finished, unless we can eliminate their commander. Elena felt something cold and final settle in her chest. He's not here for conquest, Darius. He's here for a trade. What kind of trade? Elena looked at the army of the dead spreading across the valley below, then at the fortress walls lined with living defenders who would die trying to protect her. Me for them, my willing surrender in exchange for sparing everyone else. Absolutely not. Darius's voice was flat, final. Elena, I don't care what kind of power this necromancer commands. I'm not trading you to him. Even if it's the only way to save everyone else, especially then. Darius turned to face her fully, his golden eyes burning with fierce determination. Elena, whatever this Malachar wants you for, it's not going to end with your simple surrender. People like him don't spend 17 years setting up elaborate schemes just to acquire a prisoner they could have taken by force at any time. Elena knew he was right, but the weight of responsibility for all the lives at stake made it hard to think clearly. Then what do? We fight. Darius's voice carried the kind of certainty that had made him a king. We hold the walls, we protect our people, and we find a way to turn your inherited power into a weapon instead of a liability. Elena stared at him, seeing absolute conviction in his face despite the impossible odds they faced. You really think we can win? I think we can make victory cost our enemies more than they're willing to pay. Darius smiled grimly, and sometimes that's enough. As if summoned by their conversation, a new sound rose from the army below. Not the mechanical noise of marching troops, but something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the bones of Swiss. Malachar was speaking, his voice carrying impossible distances and piercing through stone walls as if they were paper. Elena Ashford, the necromancer called, and hearing her name spoken in that terrible voice made Elena's knees buckle. Daughter of shadows, heir to powers that sleep in your blood, I have come to collect what was promised to me long ago. The voice paused, letting the weight of its words settle over the fortress. Surrender yourself willingly, and I will allow these mortals to live. Force me to take you, and I will add every soul in this fortress to my army. You have until sunset to choose. The necromancer's voice faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with dread and impossible choices. Elena looked around at the faces of the defenders, soldiers and servants, lords and common folk, all of them prepared to die rather than hand her over to an enemy who collected souls like other men collected coins. The weight of their trust, their willingness to sacrifice themselves for her protection, was almost more than she could bear. But as Elena watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the western horizon, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just a victim waiting for others to decide her fate. She was a woman with power. She was only beginning to understand, surrounded by people who believed she was worth fighting for. It was time to find out if their faith was justified. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elena found herself in an unexpected place, the fortress's armory, learning to handle weapons she'd never imagined herself wielding. The balance is wrong for you, Thane observed as Elena struggled with the standard-issue sword. Your frame is too slight for heavy weapons, but you've got quick reflexes and good instincts. He replaced the sword with something lighter, a pair of curved daggers with silver-wrapped hilts that felt natural in her hands the moment she gripped them. Better, Thane said with approval. These were made for speed and precision rather than brute force. More importantly, they're blessed silver, lethal to undead creatures. Elena tested the weight and balance of the daggers, surprised by how right they felt. I've never had formal weapons training. Maybe not formal training, but you've had 17 years of learning to survive in hostile environments. That's more valuable than any academy education. Thane guided her through basic guard positions and attack patterns. Trust your instincts, Elena. Your body knows more about fighting than your mind realizes. As if to prove his point, Elena found herself moving through the combat forms with fluid grace that surprised them both. The daggers became extensions of her hands, and she could sense weak points in imaginary opponents' defenses with unsettling accuracy. Where did that come from, she wondered aloud. Your wolf, Darius said from the armory doorway. She's been teaching you to fight without you realizing it. Every time you faced a master who meant you harm, every time you calculated how to survive another day, you were training. Elena paused in her practice, feeling the truth of his words. Her wolf might have been suppressed, but she'd never been entirely absent. How long until sunset? Elena asked. 2 hours, Darius replied grimly. Our scouts report that Malachar's forces are holding the position, but they're not making camp. They're waiting. Elena nodded, slipping the daggers into sheaths that Thane fastened at her waist. I need to ask you both something, and I need honest answers. Both men waited. If this comes down to a choice between saving me and saving everyone else in this fortress, what would you choose? Elena, Darius started, but she held up a hand. I'm not asking what you want to choose. I'm asking what you should choose. As a king, as a military commander, what's the practical decision? Darius was quiet for a long moment. The practical decision would be to prioritize the lives of many over the life of one. And personally, I'd burn the world down before I let anyone take you again. Darius's voice was rough with emotion, which is exactly why I can't trust my personal judgment on this. Elena felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. Darius, if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. But if it does, Elena pressed, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't do anything stupid or self-destructive trying to get revenge. Promise me you'll be the king this realm needs, even if you can't be the man you want to be. Darius stared at her for a long moment, then moved to grip her shoulders with gentle intensity. I'll make you that promise if you'll make me one in return. What? Promise me that if we find a way out of this, if we survive what's coming, you'll stop trying to sacrifice yourself for everyone else's safety. Promise me you'll fight to live, not just to protect. Elena felt tears threatening at the fierce love in his voice. I promise, Wuong. Before either of them could say more, a new commotion erupted from the fortress courtyard. Not sounds of attack, but of unexpected arrival. They rushed to the battlements to find the gates opening to admit a small group of riders whose horses were lathered with sweat from hard travel. At their head rode a figure Elena didn't recognize, a woman with silver-streaked hair and bearing that spoke of both nobility and significant magical power. Who is that? Elena asked. Lady Morwen of the Northern Covens, Thane replied with something that sounded like relief. A battle mage of considerable reputation. I sent word to her yesterday, but I didn't expect her to arrive so quickly. As they watched, Lady Morwen dismounted and immediately began issuing orders to her companions, a mix of warriors and individuals who radiated the controlled power that marked them as practitioners of various magical disciplines. She brought reinforcements, Darius observed. Better than reinforcements, Thane corrected. She brought specialists, people who know how to fight supernatural threats. Elena felt a spark of hope for the first time since the enemy army had been spotted. You think they can help us defeat a necromancer? I think they can help us even the odds. Thane started toward the stairs leading down to the courtyard. Come on, Lady Morwen will want to meet you, and we need to coordinate our defense before sunset. They found Lady Morwen in the Great Hall, studying maps of the fortress and surrounding terrain with the focused intensity of a general planning a crucial battle. Up close, Elena could see that the woman was probably in her 50s, with laugh lines around her eyes and calloused hands that spoke of practical experience rather than purely academic magical study. Your Majesty, Lady Morwen said, bowing slightly as Darius approached. Lord Commander Thane's message was somewhat lacking in detail, but the urgency was clear. I understand we're facing a necromantic threat. Among other things, Darius replied. Lady Morwen, may I present Elena Ashford, recently returned to us after 17 years of captivity. Lady Morwen's eyes immediately sharpened with interest as she studied Elena's face. Ashford. Now that's a name I haven't heard in some time. Your great-grandmother was quite famous in certain circles, my dear. So I'm learning, Elena said dryly. Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely comfortable with famous being the operative word. Lady Morwen laughed, a sound that was surprisingly warm and reassuring. Understandable, power that draws attention tends to complicate one's life considerably. She moved closer to Elena, her expression growing more serious. May I examine your magical signature? I promise I won't intrude, but understanding what we're working with could be crucial for the coming battle. Elena glanced at Darius, who nodded encouragingly. I'm not sure I know how to give permission for something like that. Just relax and don't fight the sensation, Lady Morwen instructed. Think of it as someone taking your pulse, but for magic instead of heartbeat. Elena felt a gentle pressure against her consciousness, not invasive but definitely present. Lady Morwen's eyes widened almost immediately. Sweet mother of all, the battle mage breathed, stepping back with an expression of awe. Child, You are not just carrying your great-grandmother's gift. You are carrying the concentrated magical potential of an entire bloodline. What does that mean? It means, Lady Morwen said slowly, that whatever this necromancer has planned, he's been preparing for something much more significant than simply acquiring another slave. Elena felt ice forming in her veins. How much more significant? Lady Morwen was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Elena, fate weavers like your great-grandmother were rare even in the old days. But a fate weaver with your level of concentrated power, there hasn't been one in over 3 centuries. And what could someone do with that kind of power? Reshape reality on a fundamental level, turn probability itself into a weapon, make impossible things not just possible, but inevitable. Lady Morwen's voice grew grim. In the hands of someone like a necromancer, that power could be used to tear down the barriers between life and death permanently. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. You're saying he wants to use me to create a world where the dead rule over the living. I'm saying he wants to use you to become something closer to a god than a mortal practitioner of dark magic. Lady Morwen turned to address Darius and Thane. This isn't just about acquiring a powerful magical asset. This is about fundamentally altering the nature of existence itself. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. So we can't let him have her, Darius said grimly. We can't let him have her, Lady Morwen agreed. But more than that, we need to make sure that the power Elena carries is awakened under the right circumstances, with the right guidance, because eventually she's going to have to learn to use it herself. Elena stared at the battle mage. You want me to learn magic? I want you to learn to control the magic that's already there. Right now, it's mostly dormant, responding only to extreme stress or emotional triggers. But if we can teach you to access it consciously, to direct it deliberately, I could fight back, Elena finished. You could do more than fight back. You could end this threat permanently. Lady Morwen's voice carried a note of fierce satisfaction. Elena, your great-grandmother was known as the Weaver of Fates for a reason. She didn't just influence probability, she rewove the threads of destiny themselves. Elena looked around the room, seeing hope beginning to kindle in the faces of the people who had been prepared to die defending her. How long would it take to teach me? Lady Morwen glanced toward the windows, where the afternoon light was continuing its inexorable fade toward evening. Under normal circumstances, years, but we don't have years. The battle mage straightened, her expression becoming determinedly optimistic. What we have is extreme circumstances, mortal danger, and a bloodline gift that responds to exactly those conditions. You're suggesting we try to awaken Elena's power in the middle of a battle with a necromancer and an army of the dead, Thane said flatly. I'm suggesting that might be exactly the circumstances required for her power to fully manifest. Lady Morwen turned back to Elena. The choice is yours, my dear. We can continue with conventional defensive strategies and hope for the best. Or we can gamble everything on the possibility that you can become what this situation requires you to become. Elena thought about all the people in the fortress who were prepared to die for her, about Darius, who had spent 17 years searching for her and would probably spend the rest of his life blaming himself if she died now, about all the innocent people who would suffer if Malachar succeeded in his plans to remake the world according to his twisted vision. What do I need to do? Lady Morwen smiled, and for the first time since the enemy army had been spotted, Elena felt like victory might actually be possible. First, we're going to teach you to find the power that's already inside you. Then, we're going to teach you to use it to weave fate itself into a weapon. Outside the fortress walls, the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon. But inside the Great Hall, Elena Ashford began the process of discovering what it truly meant to be her great-grandmother's heir. The final battle for her freedom, and for the fate of the living world itself, was about to begin. The first lesson in fate weaving, Elena discovered, was learning to see the threads that connected all things. Close your eyes, Lady Morwen instructed, as they stood in the fortress's highest tower, the sun now a burning ember on the western horizon. Don't try to use your regular senses. Let your magical awareness expand until you can feel the connections between everything around you. Elena closed her eyes, trying to quiet the part of her mind that was screaming about the approaching deadline and focus on the strange new sensations Lady Morwen was describing. At first, there was nothing but the familiar weight of fear and responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. But gradually, as her breathing steadied and her wolf stirred restlessly inside her, Elena began to perceive something else. Lines of silver light, thin as spider's silk but strong as steel cables, stretching between every living thing in the fortress. Some lines pulsed with warm golden energy, the connections of love, loyalty, friendship. Others glowed with cooler blue light that spoke of duty and shared purpose. A few burned red with anger or fear, while others shimmered with colors Elena had no names for. "I can see them," Elena whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly would shatter the delicate perception. "What do you see?" "Threads, silver threads connecting everyone to everyone else. Some are brighter than others, some stronger." Elena paused, studying the pattern more closely. "There are dark threads too, lines that lead away from the fortress toward..." She opened her eyes, looking south toward where Malakar's army waited in the gathering dusk. "Toward the enemy," Lady Morwen finished with satisfaction. "You're seeing the web of fate itself, Elena. Every choice, every relationship, every moment of cause and effect creates threads in that web." Elena felt overwhelmed by the implications. "And I can manipulate those threads?" "With training and practice, yes. You can strengthen beneficial connections, weaken harmful ones, even create entirely new threads when circumstances require it." Lady Morwen moved to stand beside her at the tower's edge. "But the true power of fate weaving lies not in individual manipulation, but in understanding the larger patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "Look at the enemy army again. Not with your eyes, but with your magical awareness. Tell me what you see." Elena closed her eyes and extended her perceptions southward, immediately recoiling as she encountered something that made her soul crawl with revulsion. Darkness. Not just the absence of light, but something that actively consumes it. Elena forced herself to examine the sensation more closely. And the threads? They're all wrong. They don't connect the soldiers to each other like they should. Instead, they all lead back to one central point. "Malakar," Lady Morwen confirmed grimly. "He's not commanding an army so much as puppeting an extension of his own will. Those undead creatures have no individual threads of fate because they no longer exist as separate entities." Elena opened her eyes, understanding beginning to dawn. "But that's also a weakness, isn't it? If they're all connected to him, then anything that affects him affects all of them." "Precisely. A conventional army might survive the death of its commander, but Malakar's forces would simply collapse without his will to animate them." Lady Morwen's expression grew serious. "The question is whether you can learn to target those connections directly." Elena looked down at her hands, trying to imagine them wielding power vast enough to unravel a necromancer's control over thousands of undead soldiers. "How?" "The same way you've been unconsciously influencing fate your entire life, but with deliberate intent rather than desperate survival instinct." Lady Morwen moved behind Elena, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Think back to your years in captivity. How many masters did you outlive?" "All of them, eventually." "And did you consciously wish them dead?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Not exactly. I wished they would stop hurting me. I wished I could be free of them, but I never actively planned their deaths. Yet they all died or suffered reversals of fortune that led to your eventual freedom. Your unconscious mind was weaving fate to protect you, even when your conscious mind had given up hope." Lady Morwen's voice grew confident. "What we're going to do now is teach your conscious mind to direct that same power deliberately." A commotion from the courtyard below interrupted their lesson. Elena looked down to see messengers arriving at a gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with whatever news they carried. "Time's up," Elena said quietly, watching as Darius and Thane moved to intercept the messengers. "Perhaps not entirely." Lady Morwen studied the approaching darkness, then turned to Elena with an expression of fierce determination. "We may not have had time for gradual training, But extreme circumstances often produce extraordinary results. What are you suggesting? That we accelerate your awakening through direct magical contact. It's dangerous. The shock of sudden full awareness could overwhelm your mind, but it might be our only option. Elena felt her wolf stirring restlessly, sensing the approach of something momentous. What do I need to do? Lady Morwen moved to a chest she'd brought up to the tower earlier, withdrawing what looked like a circlet made of silver wire and small crystals. This is a focusing crown, designed to amplify and channel magical ability. Wearing it will force your dormant power to full awakening, but Elena, the battle mage paused, meeting her eyes directly. Once this process begins, there's no going back. You'll either master your inherited abilities completely, or they'll consume you entirely. Elena stared at the delicate crown, understanding that she was looking at either her salvation or her destruction. And if I'm consumed, then the power will run wild, affecting probability and fate randomly within a radius of several miles. Mountains could crumble, rivers could flow backward, the dead could rise without any necromancer to command them. Lady Morwen's voice was matter-of-fact rather than dramatic. It would be catastrophic. Elena felt the weight of impossible choices settling around her like chains. Risk everything on the chance she could master power she'd never asked for, or accept that conventional defenses would eventually fail against Malakar's supernatural army. A new sound rose from the enemy forces below, not the mechanical noise of marching troops, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated in the bones. Malakar was speaking again, his voice carrying impossible distances and piercing through stone walls like they were paper. "The sun has set, Elena Ashford," the necromancer called, his terrible voice filling the fortress with dread. "Your time for choice has ended. Surrender yourself now, or watch as I demonstrate the futility of mortal resistance to powers beyond your comprehension." Elena looked down at the fortress walls lined with defenders, soldiers and servants, lords and common folk, all prepared to buy rather than hand her over to an enemy who collected souls like other men collected coins. She thought of Darius, who had spent 17 years searching for her and would probably spend eternity blaming himself if she died now. She thought of Marcus, Sarah, Thane, and all the other people who had offered her kindness and protection when she'd had nothing to offer in return. Most of all, she thought of the child she'd once been, the laughing princess who had chased butterflies in sunlit gardens and believed the world was fundamentally good. That little girl deserved to have her faith validated, deserved to know that love and courage could triumph over even the darkest evil. "Give me the crown," Elena said quietly. Lady Morwen hesitated. "Elena, are you certain? Once we begin this process," "I'm certain." Elena's voice grew stronger, more confident. "I've spent 17 years being afraid of what might happen to me. It's time to start focusing on what I can make happen instead." Lady Morwen nodded solemnly and lifted the silver crown toward Elena's head. "Remember, once the power awakens, don't try to control it through will alone. Guide it through emotion, through love and determination, and the fierce desire to protect what matters most to you." Elena felt the crown settle onto her brow, its weight surprisingly substantial despite its delicate appearance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded into sensation. Elena's awareness expanded beyond her physical body, beyond the fortress walls, beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible. She could see every thread of fate stretching across the landscape like a vast web of silver light. She could feel the connections between every living thing, sense the ebb and flow of probability itself. And she could see Malakar's corruption spreading through that web like poison through veins. The necromancer's presence was a black hole in the tapestry of fate, a void that consumed connection and possibility and left only emptiness in its wake. Elena could see how he'd been working for years to weaken the threads that held the natural order together, preparing for this moment when he could tear reality itself apart and remake it according to his twisted vision. But Elena could also see something Malakar had missed in his calculations. Her own threads of connection, to Darius, to the friends she'd made, to the people willing to die defending her, weren't just intact despite 17 years of systematic brutalization. They were stronger than they should be, reinforced by suffering overcome and trust rebuilt from nothing. Those connections were her weapon. Elena reached out with her newfound awareness, feeling along the lines of fate that connected her to everyone she cared about. Instead of trying to manipulate probability directly, she began to strengthen those bonds, to make them burn brighter and reach further. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every person in the fortress who had shown her kindness, who had offered protection or friendship or simple human decency, suddenly felt their own inner strength magnified tenfold. Guards who had been afraid found themselves filled with unshakable courage. Servants who had questioned their worth discovered reserves of determination they'd never known they possessed. Even the horses in the stables began to paw the ground and toss their heads, sensing that the time for fear had ended. But Elena wasn't finished. Threading her awareness through the web of fate, she began to follow the dark connections that led back to Malachar himself. The necromancer had bound his undead army to his will through magical threads of dominance and control, but those same threads could carry influence in both directions. If Elena could reach through those connections, could touch Malachar's consciousness directly, the necromancer's awareness slammed into hers like a physical blow, nearly knocking her unconscious with the force of his rage and surprise. Impossible, his mental voice hissed through their connection. A bloodline gift cannot be awakened so quickly. You should not have this power yet. Maybe, Elena replied, her mental voice steady despite the pain of contact with his corrupted consciousness. But I have it now, and I'm going to use it to end your threat permanently. Elena felt Malachar's amusement like ice water in her veins. Child, you have awakened power you do not understand. You think you can challenge one who has spent centuries mastering the manipulation of fate itself? I will tear your consciousness apart and use your body as a vessel for my will. You're welcome to try. Elena began to weave fate itself into a weapon, drawing on every connection she'd ever made, every moment of love or kindness or simple human decency she'd ever experienced. The silver threads of possibility bent to her will, probability itself reshaping around her desire to protect the innocent and destroy the forces of death and corruption. The battle for reality itself had begun. The magical duel between Elena and Malachar took place on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. While their physical bodies remained in their respective locations, Elena on the fortress tower, Malachar at the center of his undead army, their consciousnesses clashed in the realm of pure possibility, each attempting to rewrite the fundamental laws of cause and effect in their favor. Elena had raw power and righteous fury on her side, but Malachar had centuries of experience and a willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve victory. The first exchange nearly destroyed her. The necromancer struck without warning, sending tendrils of pure negation through the web of fate toward Elena's consciousness. Where they touched, possibilities simply ceased to exist. Hope became impossible. Love became meaningless. Life itself became nothing more than a brief delay before inevitable death. Elena felt herself beginning to dissolve under the assault, her sense of self fragmenting as Malachar's nihilistic worldview infected her thoughts. For a terrifying moment, she almost believed him. That existence was meaningless, that fighting was pointless, that the only rational response to an uncaring universe was to embrace the void. Then she felt something else through the web of fate. Darius, somewhere far below in the fortress, was calling her name with desperate love and unshakable faith. Marcus was praying to gods he'd stopped believing in years ago, begging them to protect the little girl he'd helped raise. Sarah was singing under her breath, an old lullaby about heroes who never gave up even when all seemed lost. Their belief in her became her anchor. Their love became her weapon. Elena pulled herself back together and struck back with everything she had, weaving threads of connection and hope and fierce protective love into a spear of pure possibility that punched through Malachar's defenses like light through darkness. The necromancer's scream of pain and rage echoed across both the physical and magical realms, causing his undead army to stumble in confusion as his concentration wavered. You dare! Malachar's mental voice was thick with fury. I have existed since before your kingdom was founded, child. I have devoured the souls of thousands and made their power my own. You are nothing compared to forces I command. To prove his point, Malakar began drawing energy from his undead army, sacrificing dozens of his animated corpses to fuel a magical assault that made his first attack look like a gentle caress. Elena felt reality itself bending around her as the necromancer's power pressed against her consciousness. The threads of fate began to fray under the pressure, some snapping entirely and leaving holes in the web of possibility that might never heal. But even as her defenses crumbled, Elena realized something that Malakar had missed. Every thread he severed, every connection he destroyed in his assault, freed the energy that had been bound within those relationships. And Elena, as a fate weaver, could reclaim and redirect that energy instead of letting it dissipate harmlessly. She began to gather the released power, weaving it into a pattern that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but became inevitable under the specific conditions Malakar had created. "What are you doing?" The necromancer's mental voice carried the first note of uncertainty Elena had heard from him. "Learning," Elena replied calmly, even as she fought to maintain her consciousness under his continued assault. "You were right about one thing. I don't fully understand the power I've inherited, but I'm a very fast student." Elena released the energy she'd been gathering, not as an attack, but as a fundamental rewriting of the magical laws that govern Malakar's control over his undead army. Instead of the bonds of dominance and compulsion that held the animated corpses to their master's will, Elena wove new connections based on the memories those souls had carried in life. Connections to family, friends, and communities, all the ties that had made their existence meaningful before death. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the battlefield, hundreds of undead soldiers suddenly remembered who they had been before Malakar's necromancy claimed them. They remembered loves lost, children left behind, oaths sworn to protect the innocent rather than serve the forces of darkness. And they turned on their master with the fury of the betrayed. Impossible. Malakar's scream of rage was audible even in the physical realm, causing the fortress walls to shake with sympathetic resonance. "I own their souls. I command their very existence." "You commanded their bodies," Elena corrected, her mental voice growing stronger as her understanding of her power deepened. "But souls remember what they choose to remember. And when given a choice, most people choose love over hate, connection over isolation, hope over despair." Elena felt Malakar's consciousness recoil as his carefully constructed army began to collapse around him. But even as his power base crumbled, the necromancer gathered himself for one final, desperate assault. "If I cannot have victory, then I will have vengeance," Malakar snarled through their connection. "I will pour every ounce of power I possess into destroying you, even if it means my own destruction." Elena felt the necromancer begin to burn his very essence as fuel, transforming himself into a weapon of pure annihilation aimed directly at her consciousness. The magical backlash from such an attack would probably destroy them both, but it would also tear a permanent hole in the fabric of reality itself. In that moment of crisis, Elena finally understood what her great-grandmother's gift truly meant. Fate weaving wasn't about controlling destiny. It was about accepting responsibility for the consequences of choice. Every thread in the web of possibility represented someone making a decision, and those decisions rippled outward to affect everyone and everything connected to them. Elena had been thinking too small. Instead of trying to defeat Malakar through direct confrontation, she needed to weave him into a pattern where his own choices would lead inevitably to his defeat. As the necromancer's final attack built to annihilating intensity, Elena made her choice. Instead of defending herself, she opened her consciousness completely to Malakar's assault, allowing his corrupting influence to pour into her awareness without resistance. But instead of letting that corruption destroy her, Elena began to weave it into something else entirely. She took Malakar's hunger for power and wove it into a need for connection. She took his fear of death and wove it into a desire to protect life. She took his rage at the world's injustice and wove it into a determination to create justice. The necromancer's corruption became the raw material for his own redemption. "What are you doing to me?" Malakar's mental voice was no longer filled with rage, but with something that sounded almost like wonder. "Giving you what you've always wanted," Elena replied gently. "Connection, meaning, a reason to exist that doesn't require the destruction of others." Elena felt the necromancer's consciousness begin to change, centuries of accumulated bitterness and hatred dissolving as the threads of his new pattern took hold. The magical assault he'd been building collapsed harmlessly, its energy redirected into healing the wounds his presence had torn in the fabric of reality. I remember now, Malachar whispered, his mental voice growing fainter as his original personality began to reassert itself. I was not always this thing of darkness. Once, long ago, I was someone who loved and was loved in return. You can be that person again, Elena assured him. The pattern is woven now. You have a choice. Elena felt Malachar's consciousness fade from their connection, but not in defeat or destruction. Instead, he was choosing to step away from the power he'd accumulated, to let go of the magical forces that had sustained his unnatural existence for centuries. Across the battlefield, the remaining undead soldiers simply stopped, not collapsing as Elena had expected, but standing quietly as if waiting for permission to finally rest. Elena opened her physical eyes, finding herself surrounded by concerned faces as Lady Morwen and several others supported her swaying form. The silver crown was still on her head, but its crystals had gone dark, their stored power completely expended. Elena? Darius's voice carried a note of desperate concern. Are you all right? Elena tried to speak but discovered that the magical duel had left her voice completely gone. Instead, she nodded weakly and pointed toward the battlefield below. From their vantage point on the tower, they could all see the transformation taking place. The massive army that had seemed so threatening just hours ago was dispersing peacefully, the animated corpses walking away from the fortress with the calm dignity of people who had finally been granted permission to rest. At the center of what had once been an army of darkness, a single figure knelt on the ground, no longer the terrifying necromancer who had commanded legions of the dead, but simply an old man who looked tired beyond measure. It's over, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute certainty. It's finally over. 3 months later, Elena woke to the sound of rain pattering against the windows of her tower room at Shadowmere. The storm that had been threatening all week had finally arrived, bringing with it the crisp sense of autumn and the promise of winter soon to come. She lay still for several minutes, savoring the simple luxury of waking naturally rather than being jolted from sleep by nightmares or urgent summons. The magical duel with Malachar had left her changed in ways she was still discovering, but one of the most welcome changes was the gradual return of peaceful sleep. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely. 17 years of trauma couldn't be erased by a single moment of magical triumph, but they had loosened their hold on her considerably. More often than not, Elena's dreams now featured golden eyes and gentle hands rather than chains and shadowed figures. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," Elena called, recognizing the distinctive pattern of Sarah's approach. Her young maid entered carrying a breakfast tray that smelled like heaven and looked like a work of art. In the months since the battle, Sarah had appointed herself Elena's personal guardian, making it her mission to ensure that the newly awakened Fate Weaver ate properly, rested when needed, and didn't exhaust herself learning to control her inherited abilities. "Your Majesty," Sarah said with a smile that had become genuinely warm rather than merely respectful, "Lord Commander Thane has arrived from the northern fortress. He's waiting in the library with His Majesty and Marcus." Elena felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Thane's visits had become a regular occurrence as they worked together to help the former undead soldiers integrate into normal society, but his presence always reminded her of the magnitude of what had transpired during that final battle. "How is he?" Elena asked, accepting the cup of tea Sarah offered. "Well, I think, though he still looks like a man who's seen too much and isn't quite sure how to process it all." Elena nodded, understanding the feeling completely. The aftermath of magical transformation was complicated for everyone involved, not just the primary participants. After Malachar's final defeat in transformation, the necromancer had simply vanished. Not in death or destruction, but in a kind of peaceful dissolution that suggested he had finally found whatever rest he'd been seeking for centuries. The undead army he'd commanded had remained animationless but aware, requiring careful handling to help them process their return to something approaching normal existence. Most had chosen to pass on to whatever came after life, accepting the rest they had been denied. But a significant number had opted to remain in the world of the living, taking new names and finding new purposes that honored both their original lives and their unique experiences as the temporarily undead. The process had required Elena to work closely with Lady Morwen and several other magical practitioners, using her fate-weaving abilities to help establish new identity threads for people who existed in an unprecedented state between life and death. It was exhausting, challenging work that pushed the boundaries of Elena's still developing powers. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way that felt like fulfilling a purpose she'd never known she was meant to serve. Sarah, Elena said as she began to dress for the day, has there been any word from the delegation to the Eastern Kingdoms? Sarah's expression grew carefully neutral. Nothing official, Your Majesty, though there are rumors that several of the smaller kingdoms are interested in establishing formal diplomatic relations now that certain threats have been neutralized. Elena smiled at her maid's diplomatic phrasing. The truth was simpler and more complicated than Sarah's careful words suggested. Word of Elena's magical awakening and defeat of Malachar had spread throughout the known world with the speed of lightning, fundamentally altering the political landscape in ways that were still being understood. Some kingdoms had reacted with fear, viewing Elena's power as a potential threat to their own security. Others had responded with opportunistic interest, hoping to forge alliances with a realm that now boasted a fate weaver among its royal family. A few had reacted with something approaching religious awe, sending delegations that treated Elena more like a divine figure than a political entity. Elena found all three responses somewhat disturbing, though she was learning to navigate the complex expectations that came with being something unprecedented in the modern world. And the refugees from the border conflicts? Elena asked as Sarah helped arrange her hair in a style that was elegant but practical. Settling in well, for the most part. The new settlement near Millbrook has grown to almost 300 people, and Lady Morwen reports that the magical protections around the area are holding strong. Elena nodded with satisfaction. The refugee settlement was one of her proudest achievements in the months since the battle, a community built specifically for people who had been displaced by supernatural threats or magical conflicts. Elena had woven protective enchantments into the very foundations of the settlement, ensuring that it would serve as a sanctuary for anyone seeking safety from forces beyond normal human experience. Your Majesty? Sarah's voice carried a note of curiosity that Elena had learned to recognize. May I ask you something personal? Always. Are you happy? The question caught Elena off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so direct. Elena paused in her preparations, considering how to answer honestly. I'm not sure I know what happiness looks like yet, Elena said finally. For so long, my definition of a good day was simply one where nothing terrible happened to me. Learning to hope for more than mere survival is an ongoing process. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. But you're hopeful? Elena looked out the window at the rain-washed gardens below, seeing the first hints of autumn color in the leaves and the subtle preparations for winter that spoke of cycles continuing despite all upheavals. I'm hopeful, she confirmed, which is more than I ever expected to be able to say. Elena made her way to the library, finding the familiar space filled with morning light and the comfortable presence of people who had become her chosen family. Darius stood near the tall windows, deep in conversation with Thane about what looked like military supply reports. Marcus sat at the large reading table, surrounded by correspondence that bore the seals of kingdoms from across the known world. They all looked up as Elena entered, and she felt the now familiar warmth of genuine affection wash over her through the web of fate that connected her to each of them. Elena, Darius moved to greet her, his golden eyes lighting up with the kind of joy that still sometimes took her breath away. I hope we didn't wake you too early. Not at all. I've been looking forward to Thane's report. Elena moved to take her customary seat at the table, noting the stack of letters that had accumulated since his last visit. How are our newest citizens adapting? Thane's expression grew thoughtful. Better than anyone dared hope, honestly. Most of the former soldiers have found productive work in various capacities. Some have chosen to remain in military service, though they're serving as protectors rather than conquerors now. Others have taken up trades or crafts they remember from their original lives. And the ones who are struggling? Few in number, but significant in their needs. There are some who remember too much of their time under Malakar's control, who can't separate their sense of self from the actions that they were forced to take. Thane paused, choosing his words carefully. We've established a separate facility for them, staffed by healers who specialize in treating magical trauma. Elena felt a pang of sympathy for those struggling souls. She understood better than most how difficult it could be to reconcile the person you'd been forced to become with the person you wanted to be. Are they making progress? Some are. Others? Thane shrugged with the practical acceptance of a man who'd learned that not every problem had a clean solution. Others may need more time than any of us can provide, but they're safe, cared for, and free to choose their own paths forward. That's more than they had before. Elena nodded, satisfied that they were doing everything possible for people caught in circumstances beyond their control. What about the other matter? Darius asked, his voice taking on the tone he used for discussing sensitive political issues. Thane reached into his traveling pack, withdrawing a small wooden box that had been carved with protective symbols Elena didn't recognize. Lady Morwen sends her compliments and her final analysis. Elena accepted the box carefully, sensing the faint magical resonance emanating from whatever was contained within. She opened it to reveal what looked like a piece of crystallized shadow, something that hurt to look at directly but somehow compelled attention. A fragment of Malakar's original corruption, Elena said, understanding immediately, from before his transformation. The last physical trace of what he used to be, Thane confirmed. Lady Morwen believes it contains echoes of the magical techniques he developed over the centuries. She thought you might want to study them to better understand how to guard against similar threats in the future. Elena stared at the crystallized shadow and feeling its malevolent energy pressing against her consciousness like a weight. Part of her wanted to destroy it immediately to ensure that no trace of Malakar's dark knowledge could ever be used to harm anyone again. But another part, the part that had learned the hard way that ignorance was rarely a protection against evil, recognized the wisdom in Lady Morwen's suggestion. I'll examine it when I'm ready, Elena said finally, closing the box and setting it aside. But not today. Today I want to focus on building rather than understanding destruction. Marcus looked up from his correspondence with an expression of mild curiosity. Speaking of building, we've received formal responses from 7 kingdoms regarding the proposed Sanctuary Accords. Elena felt a flutter of excitement. The Sanctuary Accords were her attempt to establish international agreements for the protection and care of people affected by supernatural threats, essentially creating a network of safe havens like the settlement near Millbrook. What kind of responses? 5 are interested in participating with various conditions and stipulations. 1 has declined but expressed willingness to provide financial support. And 1, Marcus paused, holding up a letter sealed with black wax. 1 has responded with what I can only describe as a formal declaration of hostility. Elena felt her stomach drop. Which kingdom? The Shadowlands. Apparently they view your magical awakening as a direct threat to their sovereignty and have demanded that you submit to binding spells that would limit your ability to influence fate beyond your own borders. Absolutely not, Darius said immediately, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had made him a king. Elena's powers are not subject to foreign oversight or limitation. I agree with the sentiment, Marcus replied diplomatically, but we should probably develop a more nuanced response for formal diplomatic channels. Elena listened to their discussion with half her attention. The other half focused on the implications of the Shadowlands' hostility. She'd heard stories about that realm, a kingdom built on the systematic exploitation of supernatural creatures and magical energies, ruled by people who viewed power as something to be hoarded rather than shared. Their opposition wasn't entirely surprising, but it was troubling. The Shadowlands possessed significant military strength and had a reputation for solving problems through violence rather than negotiation. What do they want, really? Elena asked, interrupting the discussion of diplomatic protocols. Beyond the obvious desire to control or limit my abilities. Marcus consulted the hostile letter again. According to their formal statement, they're concerned about the destabilizing influence of unregulated magical practitioners on the established order of supernatural governance. In other words, Thane translated grimly, they're afraid you'll inspire other magical practitioners to start helping people instead of serving the interests of established power structures. Elena felt a flash of anger at the implications. So they want to stop me from creating sanctuaries for people fleeing magical threats because it might encourage more people to resist supernatural oppression? That appears to be the substance of their objection. Yes. Elena stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where she'd played as a child and the walls that had protected her during her darkest hours. The fortress that had once seemed like a prison now felt like a foundation, not just for her own recovery, but for something larger and more important. Then they fundamentally misunderstood what they're dealing with, Elena said quietly. Elena? Darius's voice carried a note of caution. Elena turned back to face the room, and everyone present could see that something had shifted in her expression. The uncertain young woman who had been learning to navigate newfound power was gone, replaced by someone who had made a decision that would define everything that came after. Send a response to the Shadowlands, Elena said, her voice calm but carrying absolute conviction. Tell them that I appreciate their concerns about destabilizing the established order. Then tell them that destabilizing unjust systems is exactly what I intend to do. Marcus blinked in surprise. Elena, that's essentially a declaration of intent to protect innocent people from the supernatural threats, regardless of political boundaries or established power structures, Elena finished. If they choose to interpret that as hostile, then they're revealing more about their own priorities than about mine. Elena moved to the table, placing her hands flat on its surface as she met the eyes of each person present. I've spent months learning to control inherited abilities I never asked for, trying to figure out how to use power responsibly without becoming the kind of person who uses others for my own benefit. But I think I've been thinking about it wrong. How so? Darius asked quietly. The power isn't the point, the connections are. Elena gestured toward the letters scattered across the table, toward the reports of refugees finding safety and former enemies finding redemption. Every thread in the web of fate represents someone making a choice that affects everyone connected to them. My gift isn't really about controlling destiny. It's about helping people understand that their choices matter. Elena straightened, her voice growing stronger with conviction. So here's my choice. I'm going to use every ability I possess to create a world where people like I used to be, powerless, voiceless, forgotten, have someone willing to fight for their right to safety and dignity. If that destabilizes systems built on the exploitation of the vulnerable, then those systems deserve to be destabilized. The room fell silent as the implications of Elena's declaration settled over everyone present. She was talking about more than just diplomatic tensions or political maneuvering. She was talking about fundamentally altering the balance of power between those who possess supernatural abilities and those who suffered under their misuse. Elena, Thane said carefully, what you're describing sounds suspiciously like a revolution. Elena considered his words, then smiled with quiet determination. Only if you're someone who benefits from the current system. Everyone else might call it justice. Darius moved to stand beside her, his golden eyes burning with fierce pride and unwavering support. Then we'll face whatever comes together, he said simply. As mates, as partners, as two people who refuse to let fear dictate their choices. Elena felt the familiar warmth of their bond flow between them, strengthened now by months of rebuilding trust and learning to navigate the complexities of loving someone while healing from profound trauma. The Shadowlands won't be our only opponents, Marcus observed pragmatically. Once word spreads about your intentions, every kingdom that profits from supernatural exploitation will view you as a threat. Good, Elena replied without hesitation. Let them show their true colors. People deserve to know which of their leaders prioritize justice and which prioritize maintaining power over the vulnerable. Thane leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his scarred features. You know, I've spent 20 years fighting conventional wars. The idea of fighting for something that might actually make the world better for ordinary people. It's been a long time since I felt this optimistic about a campaign. Elena felt tears threaten at the casual acceptance and support from these people who had become her chosen family. After so many years of believing she had no value beyond what others could extract from her suffering, being surrounded by people who valued her choices and supported her convictions felt like a miracle she was still learning to trust. "There's something else," Elena said, reaching for the wooden box containing Malakar's crystallized corruption. "I've been thinking about this, about what it represents and what we can learn from it." She opened the box again, studying the fragment of crystallized shadow that pulsed with malevolent energy. Malakar spent centuries accumulating power by consuming and corrupting connections between people. He turned love into obsession, loyalty into slavery, hope into despair. Elena met each person's eyes in turn. But what if we could do the opposite? What if we could take the techniques he developed and reverse them, use them to strengthen positive connections instead of corrupting them? Lady Morwen's voice came from the library doorway, where she stood with her traveling cloak still damp from the morning rain. "That's a dangerous line of thinking, my dear. The temptation to use dark methods for good purposes has corrupted more magical practitioners than any other single factor." Elena turned to welcome the battle mage, noting the concern in her weathered features. "I'm not talking about using dark methods. I'm talking about understanding how connections can be corrupted so we can better protect them from future threats. And the distinction matters because knowledge isn't inherently evil, even if it was originally gathered for evil purposes." Elena closed the box but didn't set it aside. "If I understand how magical bonds can be twisted and broken, I'll be better equipped to heal them when I encounter people who've been damaged by supernatural manipulation." Lady Morwen studied Elena's face for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. "You're proposing to study necromantic corruption techniques for therapeutic purposes. I'm proposing to learn from our enemies so we can better serve their victims." Lady Morwen nodded slowly. "That is actually quite sensible, though I'd strongly recommend we conduct any such studies under carefully controlled conditions, with multiple safeguards and experienced supervision. Of course, I'm not planning to experiment with dark magic in my spare time." Elena managed a slight smile. "I've learned to value expert guidance." Before anyone could respond, a commotion from the courtyard below drew their attention to the windows. Elena looked down to see a messenger arriving at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with whatever urgency had driven him to ride through the morning storm. "That's one of our border scouts," Thane observed, his professional instincts immediately engaged. "They don't usually travel at that speed unless there's significant trouble." Darius was already moving toward the door. "We'll know soon enough. Marcus, have the council chambers prepared for an emergency session." "Elena, would you—" "I'll be there," Elena confirmed, understanding that whatever news the messenger carried would likely require her abilities as much as Darius's authority. As they made their way toward the main hall, Elena found herself thinking about the morning's conversation and her declaration of intent to challenge unjust, supernatural power structures. She'd spoken from conviction and genuine desire to protect the innocent, but she was beginning to understand that good intentions wouldn't shield her from the consequences of taking on established systems. The message, when it came, confirmed her fears while simultaneously validating her resolve. "Your Majesty," the messenger said, dropping to one knee before Darius in the main hall, "I bring word from the eastern borders. The Shadowlands have begun moving troops toward our territory. Not an invasion force, but advanced scouts and what appear to be specialists." "What kind of specialists?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Magical practitioners, Your Majesty, the kind who specialize in binding and controlling supernatural abilities." The messenger's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They're asking questions about you specifically, offering significant rewards for information about your daily routines, your magical practices, your associations with other practitioners." Elena felt ice form in her veins. The Shadowlands weren't just making diplomatic protests about her activities. They were preparing to take direct action against her. "How long do we have?" Darius asked, his voice calm but his eyes blazing with suppressed fury. "Unknown, Your Majesty, but based on their current movements, we estimate they could have significant forces in position within a fortnight." Elena looked around the assembled group. Darius, Marcus, Thane, Lady Morwen, and the various advisors and military leaders who had been summoned by the emergency. All of them were prepared to stand with her against whatever threat approached, but she could also see the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. This was what she had chosen when she decided to challenge unjust systems. Not just personal risk, but the knowledge that her choices would draw danger toward everyone she cared about. "Your Majesty," one of the younger advisors said hesitantly, "perhaps we could resolve this diplomatically. If the Shadowlands' primary concern is unregulated magical practice, surely some form of oversight arrangement could be negotiated." "No," Elena's response was immediate and absolute. "I will not submit to oversight by people who use supernatural abilities to exploit and oppress others. And I will not legitimize their authority to regulate how magical practitioners choose to help people." "But Your Majesty, the risks are mine to take," Elena finished firmly. "I've spent 17 years having my choices made for me by people who claim to know better. I won't go back to that, no matter what threats they use to try to convince me." Elena moved to stand at the center of the room, feeling the weight of leadership settling around her like armor. "Send messages to every ally we have, every kingdom that's expressed interest in the Sanctuary Accords, every magical practitioner who's ever offered support or assistance." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Tell them that the Shadowlands have chosen to respond to offers of sanctuary and healing with threats and violence. Tell them that anyone who stands with us in defending the right to protect innocent people will have our complete support in return." "Elena," Darius said quietly, "that's essentially a call to arms. You're asking our allies to choose sides in what could become a war." Elena met his golden eyes, seeing understanding and support despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "I'm asking them to choose between a world where supernatural power is used to protect people and a world where it's used to control them." Elena's voice carried absolute conviction. "If that choice leads to war, then the responsibility lies with those who chose oppression over justice." The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Elena was talking about more than just defending herself or her kingdom. She was proposing to fundamentally challenge the established order of supernatural governance across the known world. "Your Majesty," Lady Morwen said carefully, "what you're describing would represent a complete transformation of how magical practitioners interact with political authorities. The ramifications could extend far beyond anything we can predict or control." "Change usually does extend beyond what anyone can predict or control," Elena replied calmly. "That's what makes it change instead of just rearrangement." Elena looked around the room, meeting the eyes of everyone present. "I know what I'm asking. I know the risks, the potential for unintended consequences, the possibility that we might fail completely. But I also know what happens when good people choose to do nothing in the face of systematic injustice." Elena paused, thinking of all the people she'd known during her captivity. Slaves who had given up hope, servants who had learned to accept cruelty as inevitable, ordinary people who had been taught that their suffering didn't matter as long as it served someone else's purposes. "I've been that person who suffers in silence while others make choices about my fate. I've been the acceptable casualty in someone else's political calculations. And I swore to myself that if I ever gained the power to prevent others from experiencing that helplessness, I would use it." Elena straightened, her voice taking on the tone of absolute command. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to send messages to our allies, just as I said. We're going to prepare our defenses for whatever the Shadowlands send against us. And we're going to continue building sanctuaries and healing centers and safe havens for anyone who needs them, regardless of political boundaries or diplomatic protests." "And if it leads to war," Marcus asked quietly, "then we'll fight that war with the knowledge that we're fighting for something worth the cost." Elena's smile was fierce with determination. "I've spent 17 years in learning that survival isn't enough. Now I want to find out what it feels like to actually live for something meaningful." The days that followed Elena's declaration passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Messages were sent, alliances were confirmed or politely declined, and defensive preparations were made for whatever form the Shadowlands' response might take. But as Elena worked with Lady Morwen to strengthen the magical protections around Shadowmere and coordinate with other practitioners who had pledged their support, she found herself thinking less about the approaching conflict and more about the world they were trying to create. The refugee settlement near Millbrook had grown to over 500 people, representing dozens of different supernatural conflicts and magical disasters. Former slaves worked alongside displaced nobles, while ex-soldiers trained alongside scholars who had fled magical persecution. It was chaotic, sometimes contentious, but also vibrantly alive in a way that proved people could build something better when given the chance. Similar settlements were being established in allied kingdoms, each one serving as a beacon of hope for people who had been taught that their suffering was inevitable. Elena had also begun training other magical practitioners in the techniques she'd developed for healing corrupted connections and strengthening positive bonds between people. It was slow work that required tremendous precision and emotional sensitivity, but the results were undeniable. People who had been damaged by supernatural manipulation were learning to trust again, to hope again, to build healthy relationships despite their traumatic experiences. You realize, Lady Morwen observed during one of their training sessions, that what you're teaching fundamentally changes the relationship between magical practitioners and ordinary people. Elena looked up from the complex pattern of silver threads she'd been weaving around a young woman who had escaped from magical slavery just weeks ago. How so? Traditional magical training emphasizes the practitioner's power over external forces, spells to control elements, enchantments to compel behavior, rituals to impose will upon the world. Lady Morwen gestured toward Elena's work. What you're doing emphasizes connection, healing, empowerment of others. It's magic in service to community, rather than magic as dominance over it. Elena considered this as she completed the healing pattern, watching as the young woman's expression grew lighter and more hopeful than it had been since her arrival. Maybe that's what needs to change, Elena said finally. Maybe the problem with how magical practitioners have traditionally related to political power is that we've accepted the premise that magic is primarily about control rather than about connection. That's a revolutionary perspective. I seem to be developing a talent for revolutionary perspectives. Lady Morwen laughed, but her expression grew serious as she watched Elena help the young woman to her feet and guide her toward the recovery area where other survivors were learning to rebuild their lives. Elena, I need you to understand something about what you're creating here. This isn't just a new approach to magical practice. It's a new philosophy of power itself. And philosophies that challenge fundamental assumptions about authority tend to attract violent opposition. Elena nodded, understanding the warning. I know, but Lady Morwen, what's the alternative? Continue accepting that people with magical abilities have the right to exploit and control those without? Keep treating systematic suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining political stability? No, Lady Morwen said quietly. There's no acceptable alternative to what you're doing. I just want you to be prepared for how far some people will go to stop you. As if summoned by their conversation, Darius appeared in the doorway of the healing chamber, his expression carrying news that Elena immediately recognized as significant. The Shadowlands delegation has arrived, he said without preamble. They're requesting an immediate audience to present their final terms. Elena felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Final terms implies there's an ultimatum involved. Almost certainly, but Elena, there's something else. They didn't come alone. Elena's blood went cold. What do you mean? They've brought representatives from 6 other kingdoms, all of which have expressed similar concerns about unregulated magical practitioners. Darius's voice was carefully controlled. It's not just the Shadowlands anymore. It's a coalition of nations that view your activities as a threat to establish supernatural governance. Elena felt the magnitude of opposition settling around her like a weight. 7 kingdoms acting in concert to stop her from creating sanctuaries and healing centers for people fleeing supernatural oppression. How many people are we talking about? The delegation's total may be 30 individuals, but they're not here to negotiate, Elena. They're here to deliver an ultimatum backed by the combined military and magical resources of 7 kingdoms. Elena looked around the healing chamber, seeing the faces of people who had found safety and hope after experiencing horrors that most people couldn't imagine. Children who had been sold to magical practitioners as experimental subjects. Adults who had been enslaved by enchanters and forced to serve for decades. Elderly people who had watched their communities destroyed by supernatural conflicts. All of them were depending on her to continue providing the protection and healing they needed to rebuild their lives. Then I suppose, Elena said quietly, it's time to find out whether our allies are as committed to justice as they claim to be. Elena made her way toward the main hall where 7 kingdoms waited to deliver their ultimatum, her steps steady despite the enormous weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, the work of healing and sanctuary continued. People who had been broken by supernatural oppression were learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that their lives had value beyond what others could extract from their suffering. Ahead of her, representatives of established power structures waited to demand that she stop empowering people to resist the systems that had failed to protect them. Elena Ashford, who had once been nothing more than a slave with no name and no voice, walked toward a confrontation that would determine whether the vulnerable would continue to suffer in silence or whether they would finally have someone willing to fight for their right to safety and dignity. The girl who had chased butterflies in sunlit gardens was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love was the willingness to challenge everything that claimed authority over the people you cared about. Whatever came next, Elena would face it with the certainty that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost.